When you think of Jeffrey Dahmer, what comes to mind? Maybe it's the infamous mugshot, the cold blue eyes, or the horrifying details that dominated headlines in 1991. But beyond the monster, the media created lies a case whose complexity continues to challenge our understanding of human psychology, criminal behavior, and the very nature of evil itself. Dahmer's story is a journey into the darkest corners of the human psyche, a tale that's both horrifying and tragically inevitable, born into suburban American normalcy. Dahmer wasn't created overnight. He evolved slowly, methodically. Over decades, each choice, each suppressed impulse, each moment of isolation, adding another layer to what would become one of the most analyzed criminal minds in history. Yet even after his capture, confession, and death, the questions remain: what creates such darkness, and why? Despite every warning sign, every red flag, every opportunity for intervention, did no one stop him? Over the next few hours, we'll trace every step of Dahmer's journey from his troubled childhood in Ohio to his final days in a Wisconsin prison. But it's not just about the crimes. This is the story of a mind that refused to conform, who turned loneliness into obsession and isolation into horror. So let's go back to the beginning, where an ordinary American child first felt the pull towards something unspeakable. Born on May 21st, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, though that name would later become synonymous with horror, began life as an ordinary American child. His father, Lionel, was a chemistry student working toward his PhD. His mother, Joyce, a woman whose mental instability would cast long shadows over her son's development as a child of suburban, middle-class America. Dahmer was not destined for the ordinary life his parents had envisioned. From the moment of his birth, the circumstances surrounding him created a foundation that would prove far more significant than anyone could have recognized. The Dahmer household was marked by tension from the beginning. Joyce Dahmer's struggles with anxiety and depression manifested in attention-seeking behavior and a volatile temperament that dominated the family's emotional landscape. Lionel buried himself in his academic work, his long hours in the chemistry lab providing both career advancement and escape from his wife's increasingly erratic demands. Their young son observed these patterns, learning early that love could be conditional, that attention must be earned, and that isolation was sometimes the only refuge from chaos. In 1966, when Jeffrey was 6 years old, the family relocated to Bath, Ohio, a quiet suburb outside Akron. The move represented Lionel's attempt to provide stability, a fresh start in a community where Jeffrey might thrive. But the change of location could not alter the fundamental dynamics that had already shaped the boy's early years. The new house on West Bath Road backed onto dense woods, an environment that would become significant in ways no one anticipated. Joyce's mental state continued to deteriorate, her demands on Lionel's attention growing more extreme, while young Jeffrey learned to navigate the household by becoming invisible medical records from this period document, an event that Lionel Dahmer would later identify as a potential turning point in 1964 at age 4. Jeffrey underwent hernia surgery. The operation required him to spend time in a hospital, separated from his parents and subjected to procedures he could not understand. Family accounts suggest that the child who returned from the hospital was noticeably different, more withdrawn, less responsive to affection. Whether this represented genuine trauma or simply the first observable manifestation of tendencies that had always been present remains a subject of debate among psychologists who have studied the case. What cannot be disputed is the behavior that emerged during Jeffrey's elementary school years. While other children played and socialized, Dahmer developed a fascination that set him apart from his peers. He began collecting dead animals, found along roadsides or in the woods behind his home. At first, this appeared to be simple childhood curiosity about death and biology. His father, a scientist, encouraged what he interpreted as nascent scientific interest, teaching his son about the properties of bleach and how it could be used to clean bones. The lessons were innocent in intent, providing a father-son bonding opportunity centered around chemistry and biology. But the knowledge Dahmer gained would later serve darker purposes. Neighbors who lived near the Dahmer home during these years recall seeing the boy alone for hours examining his finds, arranging small bones, dissecting creatures with careful precision. He would bicycle through the neighborhood, searching not for friends or playmates, but for specimens. There was something in his focus, something in the intensity of his solitary pursuits that made other children instinctively avoid him. Adults who encountered him described a polite, quiet child who seemed somehow absent. Even when physically present, his blue eyes rarely made contact, his responses minimal, his interior world already developing barriers that would prove impenetrable. The birth of Jeffrey's brother David in 1966 introduced a new dynamic that would further isolate the older child. Suddenly, the limited parental attention available in the household shifted almost entirely to the infant. Lionel and Joyce's already strained marriage now had a new focus, leaving Jeffrey to navigate his formative years with even less guidance or connection. The resentment and jealousy that might have been expected never manifested outwardly. Instead, Dahmer simply withdrew further his collection of dead animals, growing his time alone in the woods, increasing his emotional responses, becoming increasingly muted by the time Dahmer reached adolescence. The patterns that would define his adult life had already crystallized isolation as comfort, emotional detachment as protection, and a fascination with death and control that had moved beyond childhood curiosity into something that demanded expression. His early years had been marked by absences, absent emotional connection, absent parental guidance, absent intervention. When warning signs appeared, these voids would shape the man. He would become creating spaces where darkness could take root and flourish. The boy from Bath, Ohio, had been molded not through dramatic trauma, but through steady accumulated neglect and the slow recognition that his internal world could never be shared, that his desires, whatever they were beginning to be, must remain hidden. The early isolation, combined with the knowledge his father had inadvertently provided, would set the stage for a transformation that no one in that quiet suburban community could have predicted. The child who had once seemed merely odd was becoming something far more dangerous, a being whose disconnection from others would eventually manifest in the most horrifying ways imaginable. The transformation of an isolated child into something far more dangerous wasn't sudden. It was methodical during his teenage years at Revere High School. Dahmer's internal world began to crystallize into patterns that would define the rest of his existence. His adolescence served a singular purpose: to shape his darkest impulses into a framework he could not escape under the surface of suburban normalcy. Dahmer's development transcended mere teenage rebellion or adjustment difficulties. What emerged during these years was a systematic architecture of compulsion that would govern every choice he made for the remainder of his life. High school presented Jeffrey Dahmer with a challenge he had never truly confronted: the necessity of social performance, while elementary school had allowed him to exist in near invisibility. Revere High School demanded participation, interaction, the performance of normalcy. His solution revealed both creativity and profound dysfunction. He became the class clown, a persona carefully constructed to deflect attention while simultaneously preventing genuine connection. Classmates remember his bizarre antics, drinking gin and vodka, smuggled into school in styrofoam cups, staging fake epileptic seizures in public spaces, shouting nonsensical phrases to disrupt serious moments. What appeared to be attention-seeking behavior was in fact a protective camouflage, a way to be visible while remaining fundamentally unknown. The alcohol that fueled these performances had become more than a prop. By age 14, Dahmer had discovered that intoxication provided relief from the thoughts that increasingly dominated his consciousness. When sober, his mind turned to fantasies that horrified even him when drunk. Those same thoughts became manageable, almost mundane. The progression was swift and devastating. Within 2 years, he was consuming alcohol daily before school. During school, after school, his parents, absorbed in their own deteriorating marriage, failed to recognize the severity of his dependence. Lionel and Joyce's relationship had devolved into open warfare, their arguments echoing through the house while Jeffrey self-medicated in his room or disappeared into the woods with a six-pack. What makes this period particularly significant is how Dahmer's internal landscape was solidifying into its final form around age 15. The sexual confusion he had been experiencing since puberty began to crystallize into something more specific and infinitely more disturbing. He became aware that his attractions were exclusively toward men, a realization that in the conservative environment of 1970s suburban Ohio carried profound shame and fear of rejection. But it was not the homosexuality itself that marked him as different. It was how those desires manifested in his fantasies. Dahmer did not imagine connection or intimacy. He imagined absolute control over unmoving, compliant bodies. The distinction would prove critical. Records from this period, including accounts from Lionel Dahmer and psychological evaluations conducted after his arrest, indicate that the necrophilia fantasies emerged fully formed during his sophomore year. Dahmer became obsessed with the idea of possessing another person completely, of removing their will, their agency, their capacity to leave him. The fantasies were not about violence for violence's sake. They were about achieving a connection that could never be severed. His father's chemistry lessons, which had once focused on cleaning animal bones, now took on new significance as Dahmer began to understand that knowledge of decomposition, preservation, and dissection might serve purposes beyond scientific curiosity. The jogger became his first specific target, not a person whose name he knew, but a man who ran past the Dahmer property regularly around age 16. Jeffrey began timing this runner's route, planning how he might render him unconscious, bring him into the woods, create the situation his fantasies demanded. He selected a location, acquired a baseball bat, rehearsed the attack in his mind with meticulous detail. The fact that he never acted on this particular plan had nothing to do with moral restraint or recognition that his desires were wrong. The jogger simply altered his route one day and never returned, removing the opportunity Dahmer had been carefully constructing. His academic performance during these years reflected the chaos of his internal state. Grades that had once been adequate began to decline precipitously. Teachers noted his increasing absence from class, both physically and mentally. When present, he stared out windows or appeared to be sleeping assignments, when uncompleted tests were failed, not through lack of intelligence, but through complete disengagement, the future that might have awaited him. College career, family relationships held no appeal because it represented continued isolation within structures designed for people who experience connection in ways he could not. The final year of high school saw the complete dissolution of the Dahmer household. Lionel moved out in 1977, living temporarily in a motel while divorce proceedings began. Joyce's mental state deteriorated to the point where she would spend entire days in bed, leaving Jeffrey to fend for himself. David, the younger brother, had become the focus of both parents' limited protective instincts, while Jeffrey was increasingly treated as an adult who required no supervision or intervention. He was 18, had graduated or was about to graduate, and therefore was no longer their responsibility. The abandonment was not dramatic or deliberate. It was the natural conclusion of years of neglect, finally reaching its inevitable endpoint. By the time Dahmer reached his final months of high school, he had become more than just a troubled teenager. He had become a being whose fantasies had crystallized into something that demanded expression beneath the drunk clown exterior, beneath the polite, withdrawn son. The darkness that had been forming since childhood had achieved a terrible coherence. The boy from Bath had discovered exactly what he needed, though he could articulate it to no one. The compulsion was no longer theoretical or abstract. It had shape, focus, purpose. All that remained was opportunity. The graduation from Revere High School in June 1978 marked not an ending, but a transition. What had been contained, however tenuously, within the structures of school and the minimal supervision of a fractured family, was about to be released into circumstances where nothing remained to prevent action from following thought. The stage had been prepared through years of isolation, shame, and the slow transformation of loneliness into obsession within weeks of receiving his diploma. Jeffrey Dahmer would cross the threshold that separated fantasy from reality, forever altering the trajectory of his existence and claiming the first of what would eventually be 17 lives. On June 18, 1978, just 3 weeks after his high school graduation, Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. The victim was Stephen Mark Hicks, an 18-year-old hitchhiker whose decision to accept a ride from a stranger would cost him his life for Dahmer. This was not an opportunistic crime, born of sudden rage or unexpected circumstance. It was the culmination of years of internal preparation, the moment when thought became action and fantasy became irreversible fact. The transformation from someone who imagined killing to someone who had killed occurred in the span of a few hours in an empty house on a quiet suburban street. The circumstances aligned with terrible precision. Lionel had moved out months earlier, leaving the house at 4480 West Bath Road, essentially abandoned. Joyce had taken David and departed for Wisconsin to stay with relatives, leaving Jeffrey completely alone for what she claimed would be a brief visit. The isolation was total. No parents, no brother, no supervision. The house stood empty, except for Jeffrey and the compulsions that had been building for years when he encountered Stephen Hicks hitchhiking along Route 224. The June afternoon, Dahmer made the invitation that would define the rest of both their lives. He offered Hicks a ride back to the house, suggesting they could drink beer and listen to music. Hicks agreed without apparent hesitation. Accounts suggest he was heading to a rock concert and welcomed both the ride and the promise of alcohol. The two young men arrived at the Dahmer home and spent several hours drinking, talking, listening to music in what appeared to be an ordinary social interaction between peers. But when Hicks indicated he needed to leave to continue his journey, Dahmer's response revealed the gulf between appearance and reality. He could not allow Hicks to leave. The compulsion that had brought the hitchhiker to the house demanded completion. When Hicks stood to go, Dahmer followed him, retrieving a 10-pound dumbbell from his weight set as he moved through the rooms. What followed was brief and brutal. Dahmer struck Hicks from behind the barbell, connecting with his skull, with force sufficient to render him unconscious. Dahmer then strangled him with the same barbell, completing what the initial blow had begun. The entire sequence lasted minutes, transforming a living person into an object, a body, something that could not leave, could not reject, could not exercise any will, contrary to Dahmer's desires. The fantasy that had dominated his thoughts for years had finally manifested in physical reality, and with it came both the satisfaction he had anticipated and complications he had not fully considered. The body required disposal, a problem Dahmer approached with the same methodical attention his father had taught him to apply to scientific processes. He dragged Hicks to the crawl space beneath the house, where he used a large kitchen knife to dismember the corpse. The knowledge Lionel had shared about bones and bleach and biological decomposition now served its darker purpose. Dahmer worked through the night, separating flesh from bone. Bagging the remains, his emotional state during this process was later described in his confessions as a mixture of excitement, horror, and growing awareness that he had crossed a boundary from which there could be no return. The disposal took multiple stages. Initially, Dahmer buried the bagged remains in the woods behind his property, but paranoia about discovery drove him to exhume them. He smashed the bones with a sledgehammer and scattered the fragments across the wooded area, ensuring that even if found, they would appear to be animal remains rather than human. The process was thorough, demonstrating both his capacity for detailed planning and his understanding that concealment was essential for continued survival. When investigators finally processed the area, 13 years later, they would recover bone fragments so small and dispersed that positive identification required multiple forensic techniques. The psychological impact of the Hicks murder on Dahmer himself represents one of the most analyzed aspects of the case. Confessions given after his arrest revealed that the killings simultaneously satisfied and intensified his compulsions. He had proven to himself that he could act on his desires, that he could achieve the control and possession his fantasies demanded, yet rather than providing lasting satisfaction, the experience created a template, a knowledge that this was possible, and therefore could be repeated. The 9-year gap between Hicks and his second victim, Stephen Tuomi, was not a period of dormancy or rehabilitation. It was an incubation during which the memory of that first kill remained vivid while circumstances prevented repetition. Dahmer's life continued in apparent normalcy. Following the murder, he enrolled at Ohio State University in the fall of 1978, though his attendance was sporadic and his academic performance disastrous. The alcohol consumption that had begun in high school intensified, becoming his primary coping mechanism for managing both the memory of what he had done and the awareness of what he still wanted to do when questioned years later about why he waited nearly a decade before killing again. Dahmer explained that the opportunity and circumstances had to align in specific ways. He needed privacy, guaranteed time isolation from potential witnesses. The conditions that had enabled the Hicks murder did not immediately recur. As the physical evidence of Stephen Hicks disappeared into the Ohio woods, scattered among trees and soil, the psychological evidence remained embedded in Dahmer's consciousness. The boundary between fantasy and reality had been permanently erased. He now possessed experiential knowledge of killing, of dismemberment, of concealment, and critically, of the emotional experience that accompanied these acts. The first kill had established proof of concept, demonstrating that his darkest imaginings could be translated into action without immediate consequence. The darkness had been given its first taste, and though years would pass before it fed again, the hunger it created would only grow stronger with time. The years following the Hicks murder marked Jeffrey Dahmer's attempt to construct a normal life, to escape the gravity of what he had done. His enlistment in the United States Army in January 1979 represented both an opportunity for reinvention and the beginning of his complete unraveling. The military promised structured discipline, a clear hierarchy of authority and expectations, perhaps most appealing to someone harboring secrets. It offered geographic distance from the scene of his crime and the isolation of military service, where questions about one's past were neither encouraged nor particularly welcome. Dahmer's military career began at Fort McClellan in Alabama, where he underwent basic training before being assigned to train as a medical specialist. The choice of specialization would later be analyzed by psychologists as potentially significant, given his fascination with internal anatomy and the processes of bodily decomposition. But military records suggest the assignment was routine, rather than requested-driven, more by aptitude test results than personal preference. His performance during training was adequate, though instructors noted his tendency toward isolation and his difficulty forming bonds with fellow trainees, characteristics that in the military environment appeared less unusual than they might have in civilian contexts. Following his training completion in late 1979, Dahmer received orders for Baumholder, West Germany, a significant American military installation during the Cold War era. The posting should have been an adventure for a 19-year-old, an opportunity to experience European culture, make lasting friendships, and serve his country with distinction. Instead, the Germany years would accelerate Dahmer's descent into alcoholism and bring him closer to the isolation he had experienced in Ohio. Fellow soldiers stationed with Dahmer at Baumholder remember him as increasingly withdrawn, someone who spent his off-duty hours drinking alone in his room, rather than participating in the social activities that defined military life overseas. The drinking that had been heavy in high school and catastrophic at Ohio State University reached new extremes in Germany. Military police reports document multiple incidents of public intoxication, disciplinary actions for alcohol-related infractions, and growing concerns from his commanding officers about his ability to fulfill his duties. Accounts from fellow soldiers paint a picture of someone who was drunk more often than sober, who reported to duty with alcohol on his breath, who kept bottles hidden throughout his living quarters. The military attempted intervention through counseling and warnings, but Dahmer's consumption only increased, suggesting that the alcohol served purposes beyond mere recreation. What remained hidden during these years was the internal struggle Dahmer would later describe. The fantasies that had been satisfied temporarily by the Hicks. Murder had not disappeared. They had merely been suppressed by circumstances. The lack of privacy in military barracks, the constant presence of others, the impossibility of acting on his compulsions without immediate detection created a pressure that manifested in his escalating alcohol abuse. He was not drinking to socialize or to cope with the stresses of military life. He was drinking to quiet thoughts that offered no respite to dull the desires that could not be satisfied in his current circumstances. By early 1981, Dahmer's alcoholism had rendered him effectively non-functional as a soldier, his superiors recognizing that rehabilitation seemed unlikely, initiated proceedings for early discharge on March 24, 1981, after serving less than 3 years of his initial 6-year enlistment. Jeffrey Dahmer received a discharge under conditions that military documentation characterized as less than honorable due to alcohol abuse. The brief military career that might have provided structure, redemption, or at least stability had ended in failure. He returned to the United States with no clear direction, no support system, and compulsions that had been suppressed for nearly 3 years. The return to Ohio proved brief and uncomfortable. Lionel had remarried, and his new wife, Sue, made efforts to help Jeffrey establish some foundation for adult life. But living in his father's household under supervision, even minimal supervision, created constraints Dahmer found intolerable within months. He relocated to West Allis, Wisconsin, ostensibly to be closer to his mother, though Joyce's mental health remained precarious and her ability to provide meaningful support was limited. The move put him in proximity to Milwaukee, a city large enough to offer the anonymity he increasingly craved. His first arrest came in August 1982 at the Wisconsin State Fair, where Dahmer exposed himself to a crowd that included children. The charges were indecent exposure, and the penalty was a fine and probation. The incident represented something significant, not the emergence of his darker compulsions, but rather a manifestation of increasingly poor impulse control and judgment. The alcohol that he used to suppress his violent fantasies was simultaneously eroding the boundaries that had kept him from smaller transgressions. The arrest should have served as a warning that Dahmer's trajectory was accelerating downward. Instead, it became another event that passed without meaningful intervention. The most consequential decision of this period came in late 1982, when Dahmer moved into his paternal grandmother's house in West Allis. Catherine Dahmer, an elderly widow, offered her grandson what she believed would be temporary shelter. While he established himself, the arrangement would last intermittently for nearly 7 years, during which time her basement would become the location where Dahmer refined the methods that had been crude and panicked during the Hicks murder. Catherine's house would provide the privacy, the isolation, and the extended, unsupervised time that Dahmer required, yet somehow managed to escape suspicion, even as evidence of his activities accumulated literally beneath her feet. for those who observed Dahmer during this period. Between his discharge from the army in 1981 and his settling at his grandmother's house in 1982, he appeared merely directionless, another young man struggling with alcohol and the transition to adult independence. But beneath this mundane exterior, the 9-year gap since the Hicks murder was approaching its end. The compulsion that had been temporarily satisfied in 1978 and then suppressed through military service and circumstances was regenerating, demanding expression with increasing urgency. The combination of privacy, alcohol, and opportunity would soon align once more, and when it did, the pattern established with Stephen Hicks would prove to be not an isolated incident, but a template waiting to be activated. Few killers demonstrate a 9-year gap between their first and second murders, yet through a combination of his persistent compulsions and circumstances that finally realigned, Jeffrey Dahmer returned to killing on November 20th, 1987, with the murder of Stephen Walter Twomey. What followed would confirm that the Hicks murder had not been an isolated incident born of unique opportunity, but rather the first expression of a pattern that had simply been waiting for the right conditions to re-emerge. The intervening years had not diminished his desires, they had merely delayed their manifestation. The night began at Club 219, a gay bar in Milwaukee, where Dahmer had become a regular presence. The establishment provided what he needed, a location where he could identify potential victims. Men who, like him, were operating on the margins of society, whose disappearances might not trigger immediate alarm bells. Twomey was 24 years old and, according to later accounts, had met Dahmer at the bar where both men had been drinking heavily. They left together and traveled to the Ambassador Hotel, an establishment that rented rooms by the hour or by the night. The purpose was ostensibly sexual, though for Dahmer, sex was never truly the objective. It was merely the socially acceptable framework within which he could pursue his actual goals. Dahmer's account of what transpired in that hotel room has been the subject of extensive analysis and skepticism. He claimed to investigators that he experienced an alcohol-induced blackout and awoke the following morning to find Twomey dead in the bed beside him. Bruises on the victim's body suggested manual strangulation, though Dahmer insisted he had no memory of killing him. This claim of blackout has been viewed by forensic psychologists as potentially self-serving, a way to distance himself from premeditation and intent. Yet it also aligns with patterns of extreme alcohol consumption that had characterized his behavior since adolescence. Whether the killing was consciously planned or occurred during a blackout, the result remained the same: another life extinguished, another body requiring disposal. The panic that followed differed markedly from the aftermath of the Hicks murder in 1978. Dahmer had been alone in his family home with time and privacy to methodically handle the remains in the Ambassador Hotel. He faced immediate practical problems. The body was in a room he had rented under circumstances that could be traced directly to him. Discovery would mean immediate arrest and the revelation of the Hicks murder as well. His solution demonstrated both desperation and a capacity for improvisation. He purchased a large suitcase from a nearby store, returned to the hotel room, and managed to maneuver Twomey's body into the luggage. The physical logistics alone required strength and determination. Dragging the suitcase through the hotel and transporting it via taxi back to his grandmother's house in West Alice where he now lived. Catherine Dahmer was away visiting relatives, a circumstance that provided Jeffrey with the privacy he needed for what came next in the basement of his grandmother's home. He dismembered Stephen Tuomi's body using techniques that had evolved in his mind during the 9 years since his first kill. The knowledge from 1978 returned as if it had never been dormant. He worked systematically, separating flesh from bone. The disposal occurred in stages over several days. Body parts placed in garbage bags that were then distributed among regular trash collection routes. Bones smashed and scattered. The process was more refined than it had been with Hicks, suggesting that even without practice, the template had remained vivid and accessible. The psychological significance of the Tuomi murder cannot be overstated. After 9 years of relative dormancy, Dahmer had killed again, and in doing so had confirmed to himself what he had perhaps feared or hoped, depending on perspective, that the Hicks murder was not an aberration, it was his nature. The compulsion had survived years of suppression, had persisted through military service, through relocations, through arrests for lesser offences. It had waited, and when opportunity presented itself, it had emerged as powerful as ever. Forensic psychologists who later analysed his progression noted that the 9-year gap is highly unusual among serial killers. Most accelerate quickly after their first kill. Dahmer's extended dormancy speaks to the role that circumstance and opportunity played in his crimes. He did not kill indiscriminately, or whenever the urge struck. He killed when conditions aligned with his specific needs for privacy control and the ability to spend extended time with remains. What emerged from the Ambassador Hotel that morning was not the same person who had entered the establishment. The previous night, Jeffrey Dahmer had crossed the threshold, for a second time, confirming the pattern that would govern the remaining 4 years of his freedom. The gap between first and second kills had been bridged, and with that bridge came the recognition that what he desired, what he needed, was not a single transgressive act, but an ongoing compulsion that demanded regular satisfaction. The template had been reactivated, and the restraints that had held for nearly a decade had proven to be temporary rather than permanent. The creature that disposed of Stephen Tuomi's remains in his grandmother's basement understood at some fundamental level that this would not be the last time that the hunger created by these acts only grew stronger with feeding. The period at Catherine Dahmer's house in West Alice would mark not just Jeffrey's physical residence, but a crucial phase in his evolution from opportunistic killer to methodical predator between 1988 and 1989. 4 more victims would fall to his increasingly refined methods, each death bringing him closer to the pattern that would define his final years. The basement that Catherine believed her grandson used for privacy and occasional woodworking projects had become something else entirely. A laboratory where Dahmer experimented with techniques that would allow him to keep his victims in the ways that mattered most to him. James Edward Dockstader became the 3rd victim on January 16, 1988. The 14-year-old had been outside a gay club when Dahmer approached him, offering money to pose for photographs. The pretense was thin but effective. Dockstader returned with him to Catherine's house, where Dahmer provided alcohol laced with sleeping pills. Once the boy was unconscious, Dahmer strangled him and began the process that had become familiar dismemberment in the basement disposal of most remains. But this time, something different emerged. Dahmer kept the skull, cleaning it with bleach and preserving it As his first trophy, the shift from complete disposal to selective preservation marked a critical evolution in his pattern. He was no longer simply eliminating evidence. He was creating a collection. Richard Guerrero fell victim. 2 months later, on March 24, 1988, the 25-year-old accepted Dahmer's invitation. Under similar pretenses, the pattern had been established with precision. Lure the victim to the house with offers of money or alcohol, administer drugs to render them unconscious, strangle them while they were incapacitated, and then spend extended time with the body before beginning dismemberment. The method eliminated struggle, eliminated the possibility of the victim fighting back or escaping. It provided Dahmer with exactly what he had always sought: complete control over a passive, compliant body that could not reject him or leave Guerrero's remains. Followed the same disposal pattern as Doc Staters, with Dahmer keeping the skull as another addition to his growing collection. The refinement during this period extended beyond method to include practical considerations. Dahmer had learned from the Tuomi murder that transportation of bodies created unnecessary risk. The solution was to ensure all victims came to him, to his grandmother's house, where privacy could be guaranteed and time was unlimited. He developed a consistent hunting ground, the gay bars and clubs of Milwaukee, where men operated with varying degrees of openness about their sexuality, where disappearances might be attributed to any number of factors, ranging from choice to hate crimes perpetrated by others. The vulnerability of his victim pool was not accidental, it was strategic. Catherine Dahmer's growing awareness that something was wrong manifested in complaints about odors emanating from the basement and garage. Her grandson explained the smells as the result of a broken freezer that had spoiled meat, or experiments with animal remains, stories that echoed his childhood fascination in ways Catherine found distasteful but not alarming. She discovered bones on one occasion which Jeffrey claimed were from animals he had found and was cleaning for display. His childhood behavior provided cover for his adult crimes, creating a narrative continuity that made his explanations plausible, even as evidence accumulated. September 1988 brought Dahmer's second arrest, this time for drugging and sexually molesting Somsak Sinthasomphone, a 13-year-old Laotian boy. The charges were serious, carrying the potential for significant prison time, yet the legal proceedings moved slowly, and Dahmer remained free on bail for months before his eventual sentencing to 1 year in a work release program. The fact that he would later murder Somsak's older brother Konorak under eerily similar circumstances speaks to both his brazen disregard for consequences and the systemic failures that allowed him to continue operating. The arrest should have triggered intensive scrutiny. Instead, it became another warning sign that went unheeded. Anthony Sears died on March 25, 1989, becoming the 5th victim and the last to be killed at Catherine's house. The 26-year-old's murder followed the established pattern, but the aftermath revealed Dahmer's increasing boldness and the evolution of his preservation techniques. He kept not just Sears's skull, but also his genitals preserved in acetone. The trophies were becoming more elaborate, more specifically tied to the sexual nature of his obsessions. The disposal of the rest of Sears' remains demonstrated Dahmer's growing confidence as well. He felt secure enough in his methods that detection seemed increasingly unlikely. Yet the combination of Catherine's suspicions and Dahmer's 1988 arrest for child molestation created an untenable situation. His grandmother, while unaware of the true nature of his activities, had grown tired of the strange smells, the odd hours the young men who visited and never seemed to leave through normal exits. In September 1989, she asked Jeffrey to find other accommodations. The request was framed as temporary, but both understood it was permanent. The basement that had served as his killing ground for over a year would no longer be available, forcing Dahmer to seek new arrangements that could provide the same essential elements: privacy time and isolation from scrutiny. By the time Dahmer left his grandmother's house, he had been transformed from someone who killed impulsively or during blackouts into someone who killed with purpose and method. The techniques had been refined through trial and error. The compulsion had been fully understood and accepted, and the need for trophies for permanent possession had crystallized into a driving force that would shape everything that followed. The move would not slow his killing, it would accelerate it, because for the first time in his life, Jeffrey Dahmer would have complete privacy in a space entirely his own, with no one to ask questions about smells or visitors or the locked bedroom door behind which his collection was growing. The apartment at 924 North 25th Street Apartment 213 was more than just Jeffrey Dahmer's residence. It became the physical manifestation of his internal world, a space where he could finally exercise complete control over environment, victim, and aftermath. During his time there from May 1990 until his capture in July 1991, Dahmer would create something unprecedented in the documented history of American serial murder, a systematic operation that combined hunting, killing, preserving, and attempting to create companions who could never leave him. The one-bedroom unit in the Oxford apartments represented the culmination of everything he had been working toward since adolescence: absolute privacy and the freedom to indulge compulsions without external constraint. The move in May 1990 had been necessitated by his grandmother's request that he find other accommodations, but what might have disrupted his pattern instead liberated it. Dahmer secured the apartment through a combination of his employment income from the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory and disability payments. The location was strategic, situated in a diverse working-class neighborhood where the presence of various marginalized populations meant that his activities would draw less scrutiny than they might have in more affluent areas. The building itself was poorly managed, with minimal oversight from landlords who collected rent but provided little attention to tenant activities. Neighbors were transient, and privacy was easy to maintain. Raymond Lamont Smith became the first victim killed in apartment 213 on May 29, 1990, just weeks after Dahmer had settled into the space. The 28-year-old met Dahmer at a gay club and agreed to return to the apartment for what he believed would be a photographic session. The pattern that had been developed at his grandmother's house transferred seamlessly to this new location: drugged drinks, strangulation during unconsciousness, and then the extended period Dahmer spent with the body before dismemberment began. But the apartment environment allowed for refinements that had been impossible previously. Dahmer set up a photographic documentation system, taking pictures at various stages, a visual record that served both as trophy and as a way to preserve the experience beyond the physical remains. Edward Warren Smith followed less than a month later on June 14, 1990. The 27-year-old's murder demonstrated how quickly Dahmer was accelerating the time between kills had compressed from months to weeks. The apartment's privacy meant he no longer needed to wait for his grandmother to be away or worry about explaining smells or sounds. He could operate on his own schedule, responding to his compulsions as they arose rather than suppressing them until circumstances aligned. The disposal process had been refined as well. Dahmer had developed a system using his bathtub for dismemberment, storing remains temporarily in his refrigerator and freezer, while he determined which parts to preserve and which to dispose of through regular garbage collection. Ernest Miller's murder on September 2nd, 1990, marked another evolution in Dahmer's pattern. The 22-year-old became the first victim whose entire skeleton Dahmer attempted to preserve using techniques that combined his childhood knowledge of bleach and bones with adult understanding of chemical processes. The goal was no longer simply to keep skulls as trophies, but to maintain more complete physical remnants of his victims. The skeleton would eventually be displayed as part of what Dahmer was beginning to conceptualize as a shrine, a permanent installation in his apartment where he could be surrounded by the physical presence of those he had killed. The hunting methodology during this period achieved a terrible efficiency. Dahmer frequented specific locations, the gay bars and clubs of downtown Milwaukee, the Grand Avenue Mall, the bus stations where young men who might be runaways or economically desperate could be found. His approach varied little. He offered money for photography sessions or simply for companionship, promised alcohol and a place to relax, identified men who appeared isolated or in need of assistance. The vulnerability of his targets was not incidental to his selection process. It was central. Men who were marginalized by sexuality, race, or economic circumstances were less likely to be immediately missed when they disappeared and less likely to have social networks that would aggressively pursue investigations into their whereabouts. The drugging technique had been perfected through trial and error. Dahmer learned the precise dosages needed to render victims unconscious without killing them. Immediately, the sleeping pills dissolved into alcohol, served in amounts calculated to incapacitate, while allowing him to maintain control over the timing of death itself. This element of his method speaks to the core of what he sought. Not the violence of the kill, but the period afterward when he had complete access to a body that appeared almost alive, but was entirely passive, unable to resist or leave the strangulation that followed. The drugging was almost incidental, a necessary step to reach the state he truly desired. Photography became ritualized during the apartment period. Dahmer would document his victims at multiple stages, alive and unconscious, during various phases of dismemberment, and finally, the preserved remains. The photographs served multiple purposes. They were trophies that could be revisited. They were documentation of his processes, and perhaps most significantly, they were a way to maintain a visual record of people who had once been whole and alive. The collection grew to encompass hundreds of images, each one representing a moment in the systematic reduction of a human being to component parts and preserved fragments. The shrine concept emerged gradually as Dahmer's collection expanded. He began arranging skulls on shelves, painting some of them to enhance their appearance as decorative objects. The skeleton he had preserved from Ernest Miller was displayed prominently, intended to be the centerpiece of a larger installation that would eventually include multiple complete skeletons, arranged in poses of his choosing. The shrine represented more than mere trophy collection. It was an attempt to create an environment where he would be permanently surrounded by his victims, where their presence would be constant and unchanging, a room filled with death that he could control absolutely. Perhaps most disturbing were the experiments Dahmer conducted in attempts to create what he described as living zombies, compliant partners who would remain with him permanently, without will or capacity to leave. He drilled holes into the skulls of victims while they were still alive, pouring acid or boiling water into the cavities, hoping to damage the brain sufficiently to eliminate independent thought while maintaining basic life functions. The experiments failed universally, resulting in death, but the attempts themselves reveal the depth of his delusion that he could somehow engineer human beings into the permanent, passive companions his psychology demanded. The apartment had become a complete ecosystem, designed to support and perpetuate his compulsions. Every element served a purpose. The locks on the door preventing unexpected entry, the freezer storing remains until they could be processed, the filing cabinet where he kept photographs and personal effects taken from victims, the blue 57-gallon barrel filled with acid where bodies were dissolved, the elaborate system of air fresheners and deodorizers attempting to mask the smell of decomposition that permeated every surface. The space was no longer a residence. In any conventional sense, it was a factory of death operating with industrial efficiency. As Dahmer's collection grew and his methods reached their peak of refinement, his apartment represented the full realization of compulsions that had first emerged in childhood. The isolation he had always sought, the control he had always needed, and the permanent possession of others that had driven every kill had been achieved. In this space, he had created a world that operated according to rules. Only he understood where life and death were his to manipulate, where bodies became objects, and human beings became components of a shrine to his darkest needs. The operation had achieved a kind of terrible perfection, each element working in concert. Yet even as this system functioned with increasing efficiency, the very factors that made it possible, his isolation, the secrecy, the accelerating pace of killing, were creating conditions that would inevitably lead to discovery. The first 7 months of 1991 represented Jeffrey Dahmer's most concentrated period of killing a span, during which his compulsions reached their absolute peak. Between January and July, he would claim 8 more lives, his pattern operating with such efficiency that detection seemed impossible. Yet even as his methods reached their zenith, cracks began appearing in the facade he had so carefully maintained. The acceleration itself became a liability, transforming what had been a sustainable system into something that generated evidence faster than it could be concealed or explained. Curtis Straughter died on February 18th, 1991. The 19-year-old aspiring model had been missing for 2 days before Dahmer encountered him and lured him back to apartment 213 with promises of money for photographs. The method had become routine, almost ritualistic. The drugged drinks, the strangulation during unconsciousness, the extended period with the body, the documentation through photography, and finally the dismemberment and selective preservation. Straughter's skull joined the growing collection that now occupied an entire section of Dahmer's bedroom, arranged on shelves like macabre decorative objects. The time between kills had compressed to a point where one victim's remains might still be in process. When the next was brought to the apartment, Errol Lindsay fell victim on April 7th, 1991. The 19-year-old had been offered money to pose for photographs, a pretense that had proven effective across a dozen previous encounters. Lindsay's murder was notable for Dahmer's attempt at another of his zombie experiments, drilling into the skull and injecting muriatic acid in hopes of creating a permanent, compliant companion. The experiment failed, as they all did, resulting in death within hours. But Dahmer's persistence in attempting these procedures speaks to the depth of his delusion that he could somehow achieve through crude neurosurgery what psychology made impossible: the permanent possession of a living being who could neither resist nor leave. Tony Hughes became victim number 12 on May 24th, 1991. The 31-year-old deaf man's murder highlighted the deliberate targeting of vulnerable populations. Hughes' disability made communication more difficult, and his disappearance less likely to trigger immediate investigation. Dahmer had learned through experience which populations existed on society's margins, which men could vanish without generating the kind of aggressive police response that might threaten his operation. The calculation was not explicit but intuitive, developed through years of selecting victims whose absence would be noted slowly, if at all. 3 days later, on May 27, 1991, an event occurred that should have ended Dahmer's killing spree immediately. Instead, it became one of the most analyzed failures of intervention in criminal justice history. Konarak synthesome phone. The 14-year-old brother of the boy Dahmer had molested in 1988 was drugged and subjected to one of Dahmer's drilling experiments when Dahmer left the apartment briefly to purchase more alcohol. Konarak managed to escape, stumbling into the street, naked, bleeding from his rectum, and incoherent from the drugs and cranial trauma. Witnesses called 911, and police officers John Balkazak and Joseph Gabrish responded to the scene. What followed represents a catastrophic sequence of failures that would later trigger investigations, policy changes, and civil rights lawsuits. When officers arrived, they found Dahmer, who had returned from the store, claiming that Konarak was his 19-year-old boyfriend and that their argument was simply a domestic dispute between consenting adults despite the presence of concerned citizens, including 2 women who insisted the boy was a child, despite Konarak's inability to communicate coherently. Despite visible injuries, the officers accepted Dahmer's explanation. They escorted both men back to apartment 213, where the smell of decomposition was so overwhelming that one officer later reported making jokes about it in their squad car radio communications. They left Konarak in Dahmer's custody. Within hours, the boy was dead. His skull later found among the collection. The synthesome phone incident should have been the moment when everything unraveled. Instead, it reinforced Dahmer's sense that he operated beyond consequence, that even when evidence presented itself in the most obvious form, authorities would accept his explanations and allow him to continue. 3 more victims would die in the 2 months following that missed intervention. Matt Turner on June 30th, Jeremiah Weinberger on July 5th, Oliver Lacey on July 15th, and Joseph Braidhoft on July 19th, each following the established pattern, each representing another skull for the shrine, another set of remains to be processed and disposed of, another life, reduced to photographs and preserved fragments. The apartment by this point had become a charnel house. Despite Dahmer's attempts at maintenance and concealment. The smell of decomposition had seeped into walls, floors, and furniture, becoming impossible to mask. Neighbors complained with increasing frequency to building management about odors emanating from apartment 213. Dahmer's explanations ranged from spoiled meat in a broken freezer to a dead animal that had expired in the walls between apartments. The excuses grew thinner as the complaints multiplied, but building management took no action. Beyond delivering Dahmer's explanations, back to complainants. Dahmer's own behavior showed signs of deterioration. His alcohol consumption had reached levels that impaired even basic function. His appearance had become increasingly disheveled. His attendance at the Ambrosia chocolate factory, where he worked the night shift, grew erratic. The careful compartmentalization that had allowed him to maintain a public facade of normalcy while conducting his private horrors was breaking down under the weight of the accelerating kill rate. The system that had functioned with such efficiency when kills were spaced months apart could not sustain the pace of multiple victims per month. The physical evidence had accumulated to overwhelming levels. By late July 1991, the refrigerator and freezer contained body parts from multiple victims. The filing cabinet held hundreds of photographs documenting various stages of his process. The bedroom contained multiple skulls, some painted, some in process. The 57-gallon barrel in the bedroom held decomposing remains suspended in the acid. The apartment had become less a residence than a repository for the physical remnants of 17 murders spanning 13 years. Every surface, every container held evidence that under any kind of sustained scrutiny would immediately reveal his crimes. Yet detection came not through investigative work or response to neighbor complaints, but through the desperate actions of a victim who refused to become victim, number 18, as the body count in apartment 213 reached 17 and the physical evidence mounted. Tracy Edwards would walk into Jeffrey Dahmer's trap and through a combination of determination and chance, walk back out alive, bringing with him the police who would finally see beyond Dahmer's explanations to the horror that had been operating in plain sight. For over a year, the final killing spree had reached its natural conclusion, not through Dahmer's choice, but through the inevitable mathematics of acceleration, creating more evidence than any amount of deception could conceal. On the night of July 22, 1991, Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old man from Mississippi, entered apartment 213, believing he had been invited for drinks and conversation. What followed was an encounter that would finally end Jeffrey Dahmer's 13-year killing spree, not through detective work or forensic breakthroughs, but through one man's desperate fight for survival and the shocking discovery that awaited police when they followed him back to that address on North 25th Street. The ending, when it came, arrived with the speed and finality that the escalating pattern had made inevitable. Edwards had met Dahmer earlier that evening at the Grand Avenue Mall, where Dahmer offered the familiar inducements money for posing for photographs, beer, and a place to relax away from the summer heat. The two men, along with another acquaintance, traveled to the Oxford apartments, arriving around midnight. The other man left quickly, sensing something wrong in the apartment's atmosphere, but Edwards stayed accepting the beer Dahmer offered and settling in to watch videos. The apartment's odor was overwhelming, a stench of rot and chemicals that Dahmer explained away as spoiled food and backed-up plumbing explanations that had worked on police officers just weeks earlier. Within an hour, the situation transformed. Dahmer placed a handcuff on one of Edward's wrists, and when Edwards resisted, successfully prevented the second cuff from closing, the casual host disappeared, replaced by someone whose eyes had gone flat and distant. Dahmer retrieved a large knife from the bedroom and pressed it against Edward's chest, explaining in calm tones that he intended to take photographs of Edward's heart, that he was going to eat parts of him, that this was how the evening would end. The threat was delivered without emotion or rage, simply a statement of fact about what was going to occur. Edward's response in that moment determined whether he would become victim. Number 18, or the one who escaped. He did not panic or attempt to physically overpower Dahmer. Instead, he began talking, engaging Dahmer in conversation about anything that might delay or distract for over 2 hours. Edwards maintained this strategy, telling Dahmer he would cooperate, asking to use the bathroom, suggesting they move the photo session to the bedroom anywhere that might provide an opening, all while the handcuff dangled from his left wrist and the knife remained in Dahmer's possession. The opportunity came when they moved to the bedroom to watch The Exorcist on the television there. Edwards saw what previous victims had not lived to report: Polaroid photographs scattered across surfaces depicting bodies in various states of dismemberment, the blue 57-gallon barrel that occupied significant floor space, the refrigerator that hummed ominously in the corner, the skulls visible on shelves arranged like trophies. The evidence was overwhelming, and it gave Edwards the motivation he needed to act. When Dahmer's attention drifted to the television, Edwards struck him in the head and ran for the door. He fled the apartment, still wearing the handcuff on his left wrist, running down the stairs and out onto 25th Street, where at approximately 11:30 p.m., he encountered Milwaukee police officers Robert Routh and Rolf Mueller on patrol. The officers initially treated the encounter as a domestic dispute, noting Edwards' agitated state and the handcuff, but listening as he explained that a man in apartment 213 had threatened to kill him, had shown him photographs of dead bodies, had weapons, and seemed capable of following through on every threat. Edwards' desperation and the specific details convinced the officers to return with him to investigate. Dahmer answered the door, appearing calm, cooperative, and reasonable. He acknowledged that he had put the handcuff on Edwards, describing it as part of a misunderstanding during what he characterized as a consensual encounter. His demeanor was practiced after all he had successfully convinced police just weeks earlier to return Konarak's Synthesum phone to him. Officer Routh asked for the key to the handcuff, which Dahmer said was in the bedroom. When Routh entered that room, he immediately observed the Polaroid photographs. Edwards had described images that showed bodies obviously dead, obviously dismembered, arranged in poses that documented stages of killing and disposal. The command to Dahmer to get on the floor was immediate, as was his resistance. He fought the officers with surprising strength, requiring both men to subdue and handcuff him. As one officer secured Dahmer, the other began a cursory examination of the apartment, opening the refrigerator, where a severed human head wrapped in plastic stared back at him. The discovery triggered a complete search that would reveal the full scope of what had been occurring in apartment 213 for the past 15 months. Skulls in various states of preservation, some painted grey to resemble plastic models, photographs documenting the progression from living victim to preserved remains, body parts in the freezer filing cabinet, holding identification documents and personal effects taken from victims. The 57-gallon barrel containing 3 complete torsos in various stages of acid dissolution. Officers who processed the scene in the hours and days following the arrest described apartment 213 as beyond anything in their training or experience. This was not a crime scene. It was an archive of death, documenting 17 murders with photographic and physical evidence so comprehensive that denial or misdirection became impossible. Dahmer's calm demeanor persisted even in custody, as if some part of him welcomed the external authority that would finally impose the boundaries he had never been able to establish internally. As police led Jeffrey Dahmer from apartment 213 in handcuffs, his 13-year killing spree had ended, not because he had been caught through investigation, but because one intended victim had fought and run and found officers willing to listen inside the apartment. Investigators stood surrounded by evidence that would take weeks to fully catalogue and process the collection. Dahmer had been building the shrine he had been constructing. The documentation of his systematic reduction of human beings to objects and fragments, the carefully maintained apartment that had enabled his compulsions, now became the evidence that would ensure he never walked free again. The interrogation of Jeffrey Dahmer that began on July 23, 1991, would prove to be not a battle of wits between suspect and investigator, but a systematic unburdening across multiple sessions with Detective Dennis Murphy and other Milwaukee Police Department personnel. Dahmer provided details that would both solve over a decade of missing persons cases and furnish forensic psychologists with one of the most complete confessional records in criminal history. This was not a confrontation where guilt needed to be extracted through technique or pressure. It was a revelation as Dahmer methodically documented his own 13-year descent into serial murder with a clinical precision that suggested relief rather than resistance. Detective Murphy, who led the interrogation, noted immediately that Dahmer exhibited none of the behaviors typically associated with captured serial killers. There was no attempt to minimize his actions, no effort to shift blame to childhood trauma or mental illness, no performance of remorse designed to influence potential jurors. Instead, Dahmer spoke in flat, unemotional tones, describing his crimes with the detachment of someone recounting a scientific process he had conducted, experiments that had failed to achieve their desired outcomes. When asked why he had killed, Dahmer's answers were disturbingly honest. He wanted company that would never leave him. He found the act of having complete control over another person satisfying. He had developed specific preferences and methods through trial and error over more than a decade. The confession to Stephen Hicks's murder represented a breakthrough in a case that had been cold for 13 years. Dahmer provided details about the 1978 killing that only the perpetrator could have known the location in the Bath, Ohio house where the murder occurred, the method of disposal in the woods behind the property, the subsequent exhumation and scattering of remains when paranoia about discovery set in Ohio authorities who had investigated Hicks' disappearance in 1978 with minimal leads, now had complete resolution. The revelation that Dahmer's killing had begun so early and had then gone dormant for 9 years challenged existing profiles of serial killer development and acceleration patterns. Each subsequent confession added detail to what would become a comprehensive timeline. Dahmer recalled not just the victims' names, but specific date circumstances of their meetings, the exact methods used for drugging and killing, and the disposition of their remains. Stephen Tuomi, killed in November 1987 at the Ambassador Hotel, marked the resumption of killing after the long gap. James Dockstater, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, the victims from his grandmother's house, each was accounted for with specifics about preservation techniques that had evolved from simple skull keeping to more elaborate skeletal reconstructions. The apartment victims, Raymond Smith, through Joseph Braidhoft, received the same methodical documentation, complete with explanations of the photography ritual, the drilling experiments, and the shrine concept that had motivated the preservation of remains. What makes the confession particularly significant from a forensic psychology perspective is the level of insight Dahmer demonstrated into his own pathology. He articulated clearly that his desires had never been about inflicting pain or causing suffering. The killing itself was merely a means to an end. What he sought was a passive, compliant companion who existed solely for his needs without will or agency. The necrophilia, the attempts to create zombies through crude lobotomies, the elaborate preservation of body parts all served this singular compulsion when asked if he had felt remorse. During his active period, Dahmer stated plainly that he had not, that the compulsion overwhelmed any moral considerations, and that he had convinced himself his victims experienced minimal suffering through his use of drugs before death. The psychological evaluations that accompanied the interrogation process documented a subject who met criteria for multiple paraphilias, including necrophilia, but who demonstrated clear understanding of right and wrong and clear capacity to control his actions when external circumstances required it. Dahmer had maintained employment, followed his grandmother's rules when living with her, and navigated social interactions with sufficient competence to avoid detection. For over a decade, the evaluations would become critical evidence in the legal proceedings to come, as prosecutors and defense attorneys prepared to argue the fundamental question of his sanity. Media coverage of the arrest and confession exploded into a national phenomenon within 48 hours of Dahmer's capture. Every major news organization had dispatched reporters to Milwaukee. The Oxford Apartments became a pilgrimage site for journalists and curious onlookers. Apartment 213's address became shorthand for a particular species of horror that combined the mundane setting of a one-bedroom apartment with acts that exceeded the imagination of most fiction writers. The public reaction mixed fascination with revulsion. Milwaukee itself experienced a collective trauma as residents processed that such extensive killing had occurred in their city. Undetected families of the victims began receiving notifications that their missing sons and brothers had been found but not alive. The grief was compounded by the details emerging from Dahmer's confessions, the knowledge of how their loved ones had died and what had been done to their remains after death for parents like the Synthesomphone family. The revelation that both of their sons had been victimized by the same man, with a second murder occurring after police had returned Konarak to Dahmer's custody, created a layer of institutional betrayal atop their personal loss. The Konarak case specifically triggered immediate internal investigations and eventually policy changes regarding how police respond to welfare checks and domestic situations involving vulnerable populations. As the confessions continued over the first week of Dahmer's custody, painting an ever more complete picture of his systematic operation. He had sealed his legal fate while simultaneously providing material that would fuel public fascination for decades. The details he shared would ensure maximum sentences and provide families with answers to questions that had haunted them since their loved ones disappeared. Yet they also created a comprehensive record that would make Jeffrey Dahmer's name synonymous with a specific intersection of loneliness, compulsion, and the reduction of human beings to objects of possession. The man who sat in the interrogation room, unburdening himself with clinical precision, had become something more than a criminal defendant. He had become a case study in the extremes of human pathology, one that would be analyzed, dissected, and debated long after the legal proceedings concluded. The state of Wisconsin, for Jeffrey L. Dahmer, which opened on January 30th, 1992 in Milwaukee County. Circuit Court transcended the boundaries of a conventional murder trial. The facts were not disputed. Dahmer had confessed to everything, provided evidence that corroborated his own testimony, and expressed willingness to accept whatever judgment the court imposed. What remained was a single question that had consumed legal minds. Forensic psychologists and the American public in the months since his arrest, could someone who committed such acts possibly be considered legally sane? The courtroom became a philosophical battleground where competing definitions of sanity, responsibility, and the nature of evil itself would be argued before a jury tasked with making a determination that seemed to defy simple categorization. Judge Lawrence Graham presided over proceedings that would last just over 2 weeks. Despite the complexity of the psychological questions at stake, the trial's brevity reflected the lack of factual dispute. Dahmer, through his attorney Gerald Boyle, had entered pleas of guilty but mentally ill on 15 counts of murder. The remaining 2 killings from his 17 total had occurred in Ohio and would be addressed separately. The guilty plea meant the trial focused entirely on the sanity question, with the defense bearing the burden of proving by preponderance of evidence that Dahmer had been unable to conform his conduct to the requirements of law due to mental disease. Boyle's strategy centered on presenting Dahmer as someone so consumed by paraphilic drives that he lacked meaningful control over his actions. The defense called multiple expert witnesses, including psychiatrists, who testified that Dahmer met criteria for necrophilia and other paraphilias that rendered him unable to resist his compulsions. The argument was not that Dahmer did not understand his actions were wrong. Clearly, he had gone to great lengths to conceal his crimes, which demonstrated awareness of their illegality. Rather, the defense contended that understanding something is wrong and being able to refrain from doing it represent 2 different capacities, and that Dahmer possessed only the former prosecutor E. Michael McCann countered with an argument that would prove more persuasive to the jury. Dahmer's systematic behavior, his careful selection of victims, his elaborate concealment efforts, his ability to maintain employment and navigate social situations all demonstrated not someone in the grip of uncontrollable compulsion, but someone making calculated choices in service of his desires. The prosecution's expert witnesses testified that while Dahmer certainly had paraphilias, these did not rise to the level of mental disease that would negate criminal responsibility. He knew what he was doing, understood it was wrong, and chose to do it anyway, making him legally sane, regardless of how aberrant his psychology might be. The testimony from Dahmer himself provided perhaps the most compelling evidence for the prosecution's position when called to the stand. He spoke with the same clinical detachment that had characterized his confessions, describing his crimes, methodically explaining his motivations, and acknowledging that he had known throughout that his actions were wrong and illegal. He explained the elaborate steps he had taken to avoid detection, the lies told to police and building management, the disposal methods designed to eliminate evidence, the careful timing of his activities to minimize risk. These were not the actions of someone unable to control himself. They were the actions of someone exercising considerable control in service of specific goals. The families of victims filled the courtroom gallery, their presence a constant reminder that beyond the abstract legal and psychological debates, 17 real people had been murdered, their bodies desecrated, their humanity reduced to photographs and preserved fragments. Several family members delivered impact statements describing the lives that had been taken, the futures that had been stolen, and the ongoing trauma of learning. Not just that their loved ones had been killed, but how they had been killed, and what had been done to them afterward. The emotional weight of these testimonies hung over the proceedings, creating a counterpoint to the clinical expert testimony. Media coverage of the trial was exhaustive, with every major network providing daily updates and analysis. The courtroom was packed throughout, with journalists outnumbering spectators and armed deputies maintaining order against potential outbursts. The public fascination reflected something beyond typical true crime interest. Dahmer's case had touched on fundamental questions about the limits of human behavior, the adequacy of existing mental health and criminal justice systems, and the disturbing reality that such extensive killing had occurred in a major American city without detection for over a year. The jury of 12 began deliberations on February 14, 1992, after receiving instructions from Judge Graham on the legal standard for insanity under Wisconsin law. They deliberated for approximately 5 hours before returning their verdict on February 15th, guilty on all 15 counts, finding that Dahmer had been sane at the time of the murders. The decision reflected the jury's acceptance of the prosecution's argument that calculated, methodical criminal behavior, even when driven by paraphilic compulsions, constituted legal sanity. The courtroom erupted in applause from victims' families when the verdict was read, a breach of decorum that Judge Graham allowed. Given the circumstances, sentencing occurred on February 17, 1992, where Judge Graham imposed 15 consecutive life sentences, totaling 937 years of imprisonment, ensuring that Dahmer would never be eligible for parole. The families of victims were given opportunity to address Dahmer directly. Several took this chance, describing their loss and their rage, while Dahmer sat listening with the same flat affect that had characterized his demeanor throughout the trial when given opportunity to speak. Dahmer stated simply that he wished he could bring their loved ones back, that he took responsibility for everything he had done, and that he deserved whatever punishment was imposed. The statement was brief, lacking the emotional expression that might have indicated genuine remorse, yet also lacking any attempt at self-justification or excuse. As Jeffrey Dahmer was led from the courtroom, to begin what would effectively be a life sentence without possibility of release. The legal phase of his case had concluded, but the questions it raised about the intersection of mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the capacity for human evil remained unresolved. The trial had provided a form of justice for the victims' families through formal acknowledgement of their losses and assignment of maximum punishment. Yet it had not, and perhaps could not, answer the deeper questions about how such a person comes to exist, and what, if anything, society might have done differently to prevent the deaths of 17 young men whose only mistakes were trusting the wrong person at the wrong time. Jeffrey Dahmer's incarceration at Columbia Correctional Institution, beginning in May 1992, following a brief period at Milwaukee County Jail, represented his final confrontation not with law enforcement or psychological evaluators, but with the judgment of those society had already condemned. Among the incarcerated, Dahmer occupied a unique and precarious position, reviled even by prisoners who themselves had committed violent crimes. His time behind bars became a daily navigation between maintaining existence and facing the retribution that many, including perhaps Dahmer himself, recognized as inevitable. The initial months saw Dahmer placed in protective custody, a recognition by prison officials that his crimes made him a target in the general population. Child killers and those whose crimes involved sexual components typically face violence from other inmates. But Dahmer's case transcended even these categories. The systematic nature of his murders, the desecration of remains, the targeting of primarily minority victims, created a perfect storm of factors that made him perhaps the most hated prisoner in Wisconsin's correctional system. Yet by the spring of 1994, prison officials had transitioned him to a less restrictive unit where he worked on cleaning details and had limited interaction with other inmates. Prison records document the evolution of Dahmer's reputation within the institution. Some inmates avoided him, treating his presence as contaminating, while others actively threatened violence. Guards reported multiple incidents where Dahmer had to be quickly moved to prevent attacks. The most significant threat came from Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate with documented mental health issues, who had been convicted of murder and who made no secret of his contempt for Dahmer and what he represented. The two men were assigned to work the same cleaning details. Despite the obvious tension, a decision that would later be scrutinized as either catastrophic oversight or deliberate negligence. During his incarceration, Dahmer granted several interviews to journalists and made statements through his attorney describing a religious conversion that had occurred behind bars. He claimed to have been baptized by a local minister who conducted services at the prison and expressed belief that he had found redemption through Christianity. The sincerity of this conversion remains debated. Some observers saw genuine remorse and an attempt to find meaning after the devastation he had caused. Others viewed it as performance or delusion, a psychological need to construct a narrative where his life retained some purpose beyond the harm he had inflicted. Correspondence with his father Lionel during this period reveals a man attempting to process his own existence. Dahmer wrote about his crimes with continued clinical distance, but also expressed awareness that his life had been consumed by compulsions he had never successfully controlled. He acknowledged in letters that he deserved the punishment he had received and that he held no hope of ever being released. The acceptance seemed genuine, though whether it constituted remorse in any meaningful sense or simply recognition of reality remained unclear to those who analyzed his words. The daily routine of prison life provided structure that Dahmer had never independently maintained. He reported to his work assignments, attended religious services when permitted, and spent his remaining time in his cell, reading or writing. The isolation that had characterized his free life continued behind bars, but now it was imposed externally, rather than chosen guards. Noted that he adapted to incarceration better than many inmates. His institutional behavior was generally compliant, though the underlying tension of his presence remained a constant factor in the unit's dynamics. Fellow inmates who later spoke about their interactions with Dahmer described someone who seemed disconnected from the magnitude of what he had done. He would discuss his crimes if asked, doing so with the same flat affect he had displayed during his confessions and trial. Some prisoners found this more disturbing than if he had exhibited aggression or defiance. His calmness, his willingness to describe in detail what he had done suggested a fundamental inability to process the human cost of his actions in ways that would have made sense to others. The November 1994 attack that would end Dahmer's life was preceded by increasing tensions. Jesse Anderson, another inmate who had murdered his wife and attempted to blame black men for the crime, had been assigned to the same work detail, creating a situation where the two most reviled prisoners in the facility were working together with minimal supervision. Scarver, who had been observing both men, had grown increasingly agitated by their presence, his mental state deteriorating in ways that should have been apparent to correction staff, but that went either unnoticed or unaddressed. As Dahmer adapted to what would be his final months of existence, a strange equilibrium had developed. He maintained his routines, attended his services, corresponded with family and outside contacts, yet the threat remained omnipresent in the social hierarchy of prison, where violence serves as currency and reputation determines survival. Dahmer existed at the absolute bottom. Guards documented the hostility fellow. Inmates expressed their disgust openly, and Dahmer himself seemed to move through his days with a resignation that suggested he was waiting for an ending he understood was coming. The precarious balance between continued existence and inevitable violence had held for over 2 years. But on November 28, 1994, that equilibrium would be shattered in a prison bathroom where the man who had taken 17 lives would lose his own to someone who had decided that legal punishment was insufficient. On the morning of November 28, 1994, in a bathroom adjacent to the prison gym at Columbia Correctional Institution, Jeffrey Dahmer's life ended not through judicial execution, which Wisconsin had abolished decades earlier, but through the violence of a fellow inmate armed with a 20-inch metal bar taken from the weight room equipment. In those final moments, Dahmer became what his victims had been: powerless, defenseless, and facing death at the hands of someone who had determined he deserved to die. The transformation from perpetrator to victim occurred with brutal efficiency in a space where corrections officers were conspicuously absent. The morning had begun as routine for the 3 inmates assigned to gym cleaning duty: Jeffrey Dahmer, Jesse Anderson, and Christopher Scarver reported at approximately 8 a.m. for their work detail, a task that typically took less than 2 hours under minimal supervision. The assignment of these 3 men together represented either catastrophic failure of institutional awareness, or something more deliberate. Dahmer and Anderson were the two most reviled inmates in the facility, while Scarver had a documented history of violence and increasingly erratic behavior related to untreated mental illness. The combination created conditions that multiple corrections officers would later testify should have been recognized as dangerous. Scarver had been watching both men for weeks, his paranoia and rage building around what he perceived as their lack of genuine remorse for their crimes. Dahmer's flat affect when discussing his murders, Anderson's continued attempts to blame others for his wife's death. Both had become focal points for Scarver's deteriorating mental state. He later told investigators that God had spoken to him, commanding that he execute judgment on these men who did not deserve to live. The religious delusion provided framework for violence that had been building since the three had first been assigned together. The attack began shortly after 8 a.m. when the three men were briefly alone in the gym bathroom area. Scarver confronted Dahmer, first striking him repeatedly in the head and face with the metal bar. The blows were delivered with such force that Dahmer's skull fractured in multiple places. He fell to the floor where Scarver continued the assault, ensuring that the injuries would be fatal. Dahmer made no effective resistance, either unable to defend himself due to the speed and ferocity of the attack, or perhaps on some level accepting what was happening as inevitable consequence. Jesse Anderson became the second target. Scarver turned on him, with the same weapon delivering similar, devastating blows to the head. Anderson would survive the initial attack, but would die from his injuries 2 days later. The violence was methodical, suggesting not frenzied rage, but calculated execution. Both victims were left in the bathroom, while Scarver returned to his cell and waited for discovery. By correction staff, the delay between attack and discovery would become a key point in subsequent investigations into prison security failures. Guards discovered the scene at approximately 8:10 a.m., finding Dahmer unconscious and bleeding from massive head trauma. Emergency medical personnel transported him to Divine Savior Holy Angels Hospital, where despite immediate intervention, his injuries proved fatal. He was pronounced dead at 9:11 a.m. on November 28, 1994, at age 34, having survived just over 2.5 years of his life sentence. The official cause of death was severe head trauma. The manner of death, homicide. Christopher Scarver provided detailed confession to the killings, explaining to investigators and later to journalists that he had been disgusted by both men's attitudes toward their crimes. He claimed that Dahmer would taunt other inmates by shaping his prison food to resemble severed limbs and using ketchup as blood, though other inmates and guards disputed this account, suggesting it might have been retroactive justification for premeditated murder. Scarver stated that he had prayed for guidance and believed divine instruction had come to serve as instrument of higher justice. The explanation satisfied neither those who viewed the killing as righteous nor those who saw it as simply another murder compounding tragedy. Investigation into the circumstances revealed multiple security failures. The decision to assign Dahmer, Anderson, and Scarver to the same unsupervised work detail. Despite documented tensions, the absence of corrections officers during the critical time period, the delay in discovering the attack, all suggested systemic problems in how the institution managed high-profile, dangerous inmates. Civil suits filed by victims' families against the correction system alleged that Dahmer's death while incarcerated represented failure of the state's duty to protect inmates regardless of their crimes. Reactions to Dahmer's death divided along predictable lines. Some victims' families expressed relief that he would claim no more attention, that his existence no longer required their emotional energy. Others felt robbed of the justice that life imprisonment represented, arguing that his death came too easily compared to the suffering he had inflicted. Several family members stated publicly that while they felt no sympathy for Dahmer, they were troubled by the circumstances that had allowed another murder to occur within a system meant to prevent violence. The Milwaukee police officers who had investigated his crimes expressed mixed feelings, acknowledging both understanding of the rage that motivated Scarver and concern about the failure of institutional safeguards. In death, Jeffrey Dahmer achieved what had eluded him during his incarceration, a form of resolution. The violence that had defined his existence, from his first kill in 1978 to his final victim in 1991, had finally turned back upon him. The man who had rendered 17 people powerless had died powerless himself, struck down in circumstances that mirrored the fundamental dynamic of his crimes, whether one views his death as justice karma or simply another tragedy in a story composed entirely of tragedies. The fact remains that on that November morning in a Wisconsin prison bathroom, one of America's most notorious serial killers drew his final breath, leaving behind questions that his death could not answer, and a legacy that would persist long after his body had been cremated and his ashes divided between his parents. The death of Jeffrey Dahmer in November 1994 did not conclude his story. Instead, it transformed the case from active criminal investigation to cultural artifact. In the years immediately following his death, Milwaukee and America grappled with what his existence meant, struggling to understand how such extensive killing had operated undetected for over a year, and what, if anything, might prevent similar horrors from emerging in the future. The search for meaning became its own phenomenon, a collective attempt to extract lessons from acts that seemed to defy rational analysis. Media coverage that had been intense during his trial and incarceration exploded after his death, with networks producing retrospectives, documentaries, and analysis pieces that examined every aspect of his biography and crimes. The timing of his death, just 2.5 years into his sentence, created a narrative arc that satisfied certain dramatic expectations. The monster had been vanquished not through state execution, but through the rough justice of prison violence. The coverage divided between those outlets that treated the case as cautionary tale about mental illness and societal failure, and those that leaned into sensationalism, focusing on the most disturbing details for audience engagement. The physical spaces associated with Dahmer's crimes became subjects of their own deliberations. Apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments had been sealed since his arrest in July 1991, its contents catalogued as evidence. During the trial, the apartment's owner faced impossible circumstances. The unit could never be rented again. Its address had become synonymous with horror, but maintaining it as is created ongoing problems with curiosity seekers and media attention. In November 1992, after protracted negotiations, the building owners agreed to complete demolition of the apartment's contents. Everything that Dahmer had touched or used was destroyed. The refrigerator, where severed heads had been stored, The blue barrel that had held dissolving remains the bedroom furniture, and fixtures all were reduced to fragments and disposed of in undisclosed locations to prevent trophy collecting. The Oxford Apartments building itself stood for several more years, though apartment 213 remained vacant and sealed the building's reputation, made it increasingly difficult to maintain occupancy. Other tenants dealt with constant reminders that they lived in a building where multiple murders had occurred, where the smell of death had permeated walls, and where one of their neighbors had been systematically killing for over a year. Eventually, economic pressures and the building's association with tragedy led to its complete demolition in the early 2000s, erasing the physical structure, but not the memory of what had occurred within it. Victims' families channeled their grief into advocacy work, pushing for policy changes in how missing persons cases involving marginalized populations are investigated. The Somphone family, in particular, became vocal about the systemic failures that had allowed Konarak to be returned to Dahmer by police officers who dismissed the concerns of witnesses and failed to adequately investigate the situation. Their advocacy contributed to reforms in police training regarding welfare checks and in protocols for handling cases involving vulnerable populations, including minors, and those from immigrant communities. Milwaukee itself underwent a period of collective reckoning. The city that had taken pride in its Midwestern character and relative safety had to confront that it had been home to one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Civic leaders struggled with how to acknowledge this dark chapter while not allowing it to define the city's identity memorials. For Dahmer's victims were established, providing space for community mourning and reflection. But the broader question of what Milwaukee owed to the memory of what had occurred remained contested. Some argued for permanent memorials that would ensure the victims were never forgotten, while others contended that such monuments would only perpetuate association between the city and Dahmer's crimes. The LGBTQ community, particularly in Milwaukee, experienced the case through multiple lenses. Dahmer had specifically targeted gay men, exploiting the vulnerability created by a combination of societal marginalization and the relative invisibility of gay bar culture to mainstream society. His ability to hunt within these spaces for over a year highlighted how disappearances of gay men, especially gay men of color, might not trigger the same level of police response as disappearances from other demographics. Community organizations use the case to advocate for better relationships between LGBTQ populations and law enforcement, and for increased attention to violence targeting sexual minorities. Early documentaries and media representations began appearing within months of Dahmer's death. Some attempted serious psychological analysis, consulting forensic experts and criminal profilers to understand the development of his pathology. Others took more exploitative approaches, focusing on the most sensational aspects of his crimes with minimal context or analysis. The volume of content created a market for Dahmer-related material that would persist for decades, establishing him as a central figure in America's cultural fascination with serial killers. Changes to police procedure emerged directly from failures identified in Dahmer's case. The Konarak Somphone incident, in particular, became a teaching example in law enforcement training about the dangers of making assumptions, the necessity of thorough investigation, even in seemingly routine domestic situations, and the importance of listening to community members who report concerns. Milwaukee Police Department implemented new protocols for missing persons cases involving vulnerable populations and for responding to welfare checks involving potential abuse or endangerment. As the immediate shock settled and raw emotion began fading into processed grief, what remained was a cultural wound that refused to heal cleanly. Milwaukee had been transformed from quiet Midwestern city into the answer to a grim question in true crime. History, families of 17 victims continued navigating grief, compounded by knowledge of how their loved ones had died, while broader culture began the extended process of attempting to understand what Dahmer represented. The immediate aftermath had provided answers to investigative questions about who had killed these men and how, but it had opened larger questions about the nature of such extreme pathology that would draw researchers, documentarians, and the morbidly curious for generations to come. The search for meaning in horror, that by its nature defies meaning, had only begun. 3 decades after Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes came to light, and nearly 30 years after his death, his case remains a subject of intense study, representation, and controversy. The confrontation now exists not between Dahmer and his victims, or Dahmer and the justice system, but between society's desire to understand such extreme pathology and the obligation to respect those whose lives were destroyed in examining what his case has revealed about psychology, criminal behavior, and cultural memory. We must navigate the tension between education and exploitation, between understanding darkness and amplifying it. The decades since 1991 have seen Dahmer's case become foundational to criminal psychology and forensic profiling. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit incorporated his case into their database of serial offender patterns, using his confessions, crime scene evidence, and psychological evaluations to refine understanding of necrophilic homicide and the role of paraphilias in serial murder. His extended dormancy period between first and second kills challenged existing theories about serial killer acceleration, while his systematic approach to victim selection, disposal, and preservation provided insights into how organized offenders operate over extended periods. The comprehensive nature of his confessions made his case unusually valuable for research purposes, offering detail that is often absent in cases where perpetrators maintain denial or provide only partial admissions. Forensic psychology programs at universities worldwide include Dahmer as a case study in courses examining sexual homicide, criminal psychopathy, and the intersection of mental illness with criminal behavior. His case illustrates the distinction between legal insanity and psychological abnormality, demonstrating how someone can meet diagnostic criteria for multiple paraphilias while still possessing the capacity for criminal responsibility. That his jury affirmed, the ongoing academic analysis has contributed to refined understanding of how compulsive disorders differ from impulse control disorders, and how neither necessarily negates culpability under law. The explosion of true crime as a cultural phenomenon in the 21st century has placed Dahmer at the center of an industry that generates billions of dollars annually in content consumption, from podcasts to documentaries to dramatized series. His name recognition rivals that of historical figures from other fields, making him paradoxically one of the most famous Americans of the late 20th century. This fame raises profound ethical questions about the relationship between public interest in criminal cases and the dignity owed to victims and their families. Each new documentary or dramatization reopens wounds for those who lost loved ones to his crimes, while simultaneously educating new generations about the realities of serial murder. The 2022 Netflix series Monster. The Jeffrey Dahmer story became one of the platform's most watched releases, generating intense controversy for its approach to depicting his crimes. Family members of victims publicly criticized the production, stating they had not been consulted or compensated, and arguing that the series re-traumatized them by forcing renewed public attention on the worst moments of their lives. The controversy highlighted the ethical complexities of true crime entertainment, where the line between educational content and exploitation remains contested. The series' massive viewership demonstrated persistent public fascination, while the family's anguished responses reminded consumers that these stories involve real, ongoing grief, not just historical curiosity. Lionel Dahmer's 1994 memoir. A father's story provided perspective from someone who had been both intimately connected to Jeffrey and devastatingly ignorant of his crimes. The book attempted to trace warning signs Lionel had missed, to identify moments where intervention might have altered the trajectory, and to process guilt over his failures as a parent. While some readers found value in his reflections, others criticized the project as another form of profiting from tragedy. The memoir raised questions about familial responsibility and whether parents can truly identify pathology in their children before it manifests in irreversible ways. Victims' families have worked to ensure that the 17 men who died are remembered as individuals rather than as statistics. In Dahmer's body count efforts to document their lives, their aspirations, their relationships, and their value beyond the manner of their deaths have provided counter-narrative to the overwhelming focus on their killer organizations supporting families of murder victims. Have used Dahmer's case to advocate for victim-centered approaches to true crime coverage that prioritize the humanity of those killed over fascination with perpetrators. The LGBTQ community's relationship with the Dahmer case continues to evolve. His targeting of gay men highlighted vulnerabilities created by marginalization and the ways that homophobia, whether overt or systemic, can create conditions where certain populations face heightened risk. Advocacy groups have used the case to push for improved hate crime legislation, better police training regarding crimes against LGBTQ individuals, and increased resources for missing persons cases involving sexual minorities. The conversation has expanded beyond Dahmer, specifically to address broader patterns of violence against LGBTQ people, particularly those who are also racial minorities. Law enforcement training has been permanently altered by lessons drawn from the case. The Konarak Sinthason phone incident became a touchstone example of how implicit bias, inadequate investigation, and failure to listen to community witnesses can have fatal consequences. Police departments nationwide revised protocols for welfare checks, missing persons investigations, and responses to domestic situations. The case demonstrated that thorough investigation cannot be sacrificed for convenience, and that officers must question their own assumptions, particularly when dealing with marginalized populations. Mental health professionals have gained nuanced understanding of how paraphilias develop and manifest in extreme cases. Dahmer's detailed confessions and the psychological evaluations conducted throughout his prosecution, provided unusually complete documentation of his internal experience. This has informed treatment approaches for individuals presenting with concerning paraphilic interests and has contributed to ongoing debates about the relationship between sexual orientation, sexual dysfunction, and violent behavior. His case illustrates that while most people with paraphilias never harm others, the intersection of multiple factors, including social isolation, inability to form healthy relationships, and access to vulnerable victims, can create catastrophic outcomes. Society's fascination with serial killers, which Dahmer has come to exemplify, poses questions about cultural health and the purposes such interest serves. Psychological research suggests that engagement with true crime content allows people to vicariously experience danger while maintaining safety, to study evil from distance, and to reinforce their own sense of normalcy, by contrast with extreme deviance. Yet there remains concern that excessive focus on perpetrators, particularly when it ventures into admiration or romanticization, disrespects victims and may even inspire copycat behavior. The balance between legitimate educational interest and unhealthy obsession remains difficult to establish. The tension between remembering and moving forward defines how Dahmer's legacy persists. Victims' families need acknowledgement of their losses and recognition of systemic failures that enabled the crimes, yet they also deserve to grieve without constant media intrusion. Milwaukee as a city must acknowledge this dark chapter of its history, while not allowing it to overshadow other aspects of civic identity. The broader culture continues wrestling with how to engage with such cases in ways that honor victims, educate the public, and contribute to prevention without descending into exploitation or sensationalism. As each new generation discovers the case, through whatever media vehicle is current, these questions resurface, requiring renewed examination of our collective relationship with true crime and the responsibilities that come with studying the darkest manifestations of human behavior. In the annals of American criminal history, few cases embody the intersection of psychology, pathology, and societal failure, quite like Jeffrey Dahmer, from his troubled childhood in Bath, Ohio, to his violent death in a Wisconsin prison. Dahmer's story represents more than a chronicle of serial murder. It stands as a comprehensive study in the nature of compulsion, the limits of intervention, and the lasting impact such crimes leave on communities, individuals, and collective consciousness. His legacy stretches across multiple domains, from advances in forensic psychology to changes in law enforcement protocol, to ongoing debates about how society engages with its darkest chapters. The contributions to criminal psychology and forensic science are substantial and ongoing. Dahmer's case provided unprecedented documentation of necrophilic homicide, paraphilic disorders, and the psychology of serial murder. His willingness to confess in detail created a research resource that continues to inform clinical practice and criminal profiling decades after his death. Behavioral analysts study his victim selection patterns, his methods of concealment, and his psychological motivations to better understand organized serial offenders. The 9-year gap between his first and second kills challenges conventional theories about serial killer acceleration, while his systematic approach to creating a collection of human remains represents an extreme manifestation of control and possession drives that exist on spectrums in the general population. Law enforcement agencies, transformed their approaches to missing persons investigations, particularly those involving vulnerable populations, the failures in Dahmer's case, especially the Konarak synthesomphone incident, became case studies in what not to do. Police training programs nationwide now emphasize the importance of thorough investigation, even in seemingly routine calls, the necessity of listening to community witnesses, and the dangers of allowing implicit biases to override evidence-based assessment. Milwaukee Police Department specifically implemented reforms requiring more rigorous documentation of welfare checks, mandatory follow-up on reports involving potential abuse, and improved protocols for cases involving non-English speaking populations or individuals with disabilities. The legal system's handling of the insanity defense in Dahmer's trial contributed to ongoing refinements in how courts distinguish between mental illness and legal responsibility. His case demonstrated that the presence of severe paraphilias does not automatically negate criminal culpability, that understanding right from wrong and possessing the capacity to conform behavior to law can coexist with profoundly disordered psychology. The verdict affirmed principles that continue to guide competency evaluations and insanity determinations in jurisdictions. Nationwide, cultural impact manifests in the permanent integration of Dahmer's case into America's consciousness of serial murder. He has become arguably the most recognizable serial killer of the modern era. His name's synonymous with a particular brand of horror that combines mundane suburban settings with unthinkable acts. The true crime industry that has exploded in the 21st century places him at its center, with his case generating continuous content across every media platform. This raises profound questions about the line between education and exploitation, between legitimate interest in understanding criminal psychology and voyeuristic fascination with violence. Victim advocacy organizations have used the case to push for reforms, ensuring that in media coverage and public discourse, victims are remembered as individuals rather than statistics. The 17 men Jeffrey Dahmer murdered: Stephen Mark Hicks, Stephen Walter Tuomi, James Edward Dockstater, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Hughes, Raymond Lamont Smith, Edward Warren Smith, Ernest Markey, Miller, David Courtney, Thomas Curtis, Durrell Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Anthony Sears, Tony Anthony Hughes, Konarak, Synthesomphone, Matt Cleveland Turner, Jeremiah, Benjamin Weinberger, Oliver Joseph Lacey, and Joseph Arthur Braidhoft. Each had lives, dreams, relationships, and value that extended far beyond their final moments. Families have worked to document who these men were, what they contributed to their communities, and how their absences created voids that can never be filled. The LGBTQ community continues processing the case's implications. Dahmer's targeting of gay men, particularly gay men of color, exposed vulnerabilities created by marginalization and demonstrated how homophobia, whether explicit or systemic, creates conditions where certain populations face disproportionate risk. Advocacy organizations have leveraged the case to demand better protection for LGBTQ individuals, improved hate crime legislation, and increased resources for investigating violence against sexual minorities. The conversation has evolved from Dahmer specifically to addressing broader patterns of violence and the societal failures that enable predators to operate within marginalized communities. Milwaukee's transformation reflects a city that has had to integrate this dark chapter into its identity without allowing it to define civic character memorials. Honor the victims, community organizations, work to ensure lessons learned translate into protective actions for current vulnerable populations. The Oxford apartment site, where apartment 213 once stood, now contains different structures, but the memory of what occurred there persists in local consciousness. The city's handling of this legacy, balancing acknowledgement with forward movement, provides a model for other communities forced to reckon with similar tragedies. Media representations have evolved from early exploitative coverage to more sophisticated analysis, though ethical concerns persist. Each new documentary series or dramatization must navigate the tension between public interest and victims' families' need for peace. Educational programs in criminology, psychology, and sociology use the case to illustrate principles about criminal behavior, mental health, and systemic failure, while continuously grappling with how to do so respectfully. Lionel Dahmer's memoir and subsequent interviews provided perspective on parental recognition of warning signs and the guilt that accompanies realizing one failed to prevent horror. His reflections contribute to ongoing discussions about early intervention, childhood behavioral indicators, and the limits of parental influence when confronting severe pathology. The ongoing research citing Dahmer's case spans disciplines from neuroscience, examining brain structure abnormalities in individuals with severe paraphilias, to sociology, analyzing how isolation and marginalization contribute to violence, to philosophy, debating the nature of evil and moral responsibility. Hundreds of academic papers, dissertations, and books have examined aspects of his psychology, his crimes, and their aftermath, ensuring that the case continues informing scholarly understanding of human behavior at its extremes. Jeffrey Dahmer's legacy serves as a stark reminder that even in societies with extensive institutions and safeguards, darkness can flourish when warning signs go unheeded, when vulnerable populations are dismissed, and when the fundamental humanity of others is forgotten. His case compels confrontation with uncomfortable truths about human nature. The capacity for extreme pathology and collective responsibility to protect one another from those who would cause harm. The 17 lives he destroyed represent irreplaceable losses that extend far beyond the individuals themselves, affecting families, communities, and society's sense of safety and order. In death as in life, Dahmer's story forces examination of how we identify, intervene against, and remember such extreme manifestations of human capability for harm. His final rest in cremation, his ashes divided between parents who had failed in different ways to prevent his trajectory, stands as metaphor for how society handles its darkest chapters, acknowledged, studied, but never celebrated. The ripples of his existence continue influencing understanding of criminal psychology, victim advocacy, and the true cost of isolation taken to its most horrifying extreme. His legacy endures not in admiration or fascination, but as testament to the devastating consequences when compulsion overwhelms conscience, when loneliness transforms into obsession, and when society fails to recognize and respond to darkness before it claims innocent lives. As we close this examination of Jeffrey Dahmer's life and crimes, we are left with questions that transcend his individual case and touch upon fundamental aspects of human psychology, societal responsibility, and the mechanisms through which evil manifests and persists. The weight of his legacy presses upon multiple domains, each revealing different facets of how one person's pathology can reshape understanding, influence policy, and force confrontation with uncomfortable truths about the human capacity for harm and society's capacity for failure. The forensic psychology community continues to mine Dahmer's case for insights that inform both clinical practice and criminal investigation. His comprehensive confessions combined with extensive documentation of his crimes created an archive of data that remains unparalleled in studies of serial sexual homicide. Researchers examining the development of paraphilias, the role of isolation in violent fantasy escalation, and the psychology of necrophilia return repeatedly to his case as exemplar. The distinction his trial established between possessing severe mental disorders and lacking criminal responsibility continues shaping legal standards for competency and insanity determinations. His case demonstrates that profound psychological abnormality can coexist with the capacity for planning, concealment, and behavioral control that characterizes legal sanity. Law enforcement training programs have integrated lessons from the multiple intervention failures that punctuated Dahmer's killing spree. The return of Konarak's synthesomphone to his killer by police officers who failed to adequately investigate has become a cautionary case study taught in academies nationwide, illustrating how implicit bias, inadequate questioning, and premature assumptions can have fatal consequences. Missing persons protocols have been revised to ensure greater attention to cases involving marginalized populations, recognition that vulnerability creates both opportunity for predators and reduced likelihood of aggressive investigation. The reforms represent acknowledgement that certain lives had been treated as less worthy of protection, and that systemic change was necessary to prevent future failures. The victim advocacy movement has used Dahmer's case to advance principles of victim-centered approaches to crime coverage, and commemoration organizations work to ensure that Stephen Mark Hicks, Stephen Walter, Tuomi, James, Edward Dockstater, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Hughes, Raymond Lamont Smith, Edward Warren Smith, Ernest Marcus Miller, David Courtney, Thomas Curtis, Durrell Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Anthony Sears, Tony Anthony Hughes, Konarak, Synthesomphone, Matt Cleveland Turner, Jeremiah Benjamin Weinberger, Oliver Joseph Lacey, and Joseph Arthur Braidhoft are remembered for who they were rather than how they died. Efforts to document their aspirations, relationships, and contributions provide necessary counterweight to the overwhelming focus on their killer that dominates public discourse. The LGBTQ community's ongoing relationship with the case reflects both the trauma of Dahmer's targeting of gay men and the activism that has emerged from that pain. His ability to hunt within gay spaces for years, exploiting both the vulnerability created by marginalization and the relative invisibility of these communities to mainstream law enforcement has driven advocacy for improved hate crime legislation, better police training regarding crimes against sexual minorities, and increased resources for investigating violence within LGBT populations. The conversation has expanded beyond Dahmer to address broader patterns of violence that disproportionately affect those who exist at intersections of multiple marginalized identities. Milwaukee carries the case as permanent part of its civic identity, a reality the city has had to integrate while refusing to allow this dark chapter to define its character. Memorials to victims, community education programs, and continued policy reforms represent ongoing attempts to honor those who were killed while working to prevent similar tragedies. The physical spaces associated with Dahmer have been demolished, but the memory of what occurred persists, shaping how the city approaches issues of public safety, vulnerable population protection, and the responsibilities of institutions to recognize and respond to warning signs. The true crime industry that has flourished in recent decades places Dahmer at its center, his case generating continuous content across every media platform, from podcasts to documentaries to dramatized series. This raises ethical questions that remain unresolved about the balance between legitimate educational interest in understanding criminal psychology and voyeuristic consumption of others' suffering. Each new representation must navigate tension between public fascination and victims' families' need for peace, between honoring the dead and exploiting tragedy for entertainment or profit. The 2022 Netflix series that became one of the platform's most watched releases, while simultaneously traumatizing victims' families, exemplifies these ongoing tensions. Academic disciplines from neuroscience to sociology to philosophy continue examining aspects of Dahmer's psychology and crimes. Hundreds of papers, dissertations, and books have been produced, analyzing everything from potential neurological abnormalities to the role of childhood trauma to the philosophical questions about evil and moral responsibility. His case provides a nexus point where multiple fields of inquiry converge, each seeking to extract understanding from acts that fundamentally resist rational explanation. The medical and mental health communities have gained refined understanding of how paraphilias develop, manifest, and in rare cases combine with other factors to produce violent outcomes. Dahmer's detailed accounts of his internal experience, his recognition that his desires were abnormal, combined with his inability or unwillingness to seek help before acting on them, has informed approaches to treating individuals presenting with concerning paraphilic interests. The case illustrates both the limits of intervention when individuals conceal their pathology and the critical importance of creating environments where people can seek help for disturbing thoughts before they manifest in harmful actions. Prison reform advocates have used Dahmer's death to examine how correctional systems manage high-profile inmates and protect those in their custody, even when those individuals have committed heinous crimes. The security failures that allowed Christopher Scarver unsupervised access to both Dahmer and Jesse Anderson prompted investigations and policy changes regarding work detail assignments and supervision of vulnerable prisoners. The broader question of how society remembers and engages with such cases remains contested. Some argue for detailed documentation and analysis as necessary for understanding, preventing, and learning from extreme criminal behavior. Others contend that excessive focus on perpetrators dishonors victims and may inspire those seeking notoriety through violence. The balance between remembering to learn and remembering in ways that cause additional harm requires constant negotiation. As each generation encounters these stories through contemporary media, Lionel Dahmer's continuing efforts to process his son's crimes and his own failures as a parent provide perspective on guilt, responsibility, and the limits of parental influence. His reflections contribute to discussions about recognizing warning signs in children and the question of whether intervention at earlier stages might have altered outcomes while offering no definitive answers. His testimony to the difficulty of distinguishing severe pathology from typical adolescent struggles resonates with parents navigating similar uncertainties. Jeffrey Dahmer's story compels us to examine how darkness emerges how it goes unrecognized, and how society responds when confronted with evil that operated in plain sight. His case stands as reminder that institutional safeguards are only as effective as the individuals implementing them, that vulnerable populations require specific protections precisely because their marginalization creates opportunity for exploitation, and that the true cost of such crimes extends far beyond the immediate victims to encompass families, communities, and collective sense of security. The 17 men whose lives ended in apartment 213 or his grandmother's basement deserve to be understood as individuals whose absence represents profound loss, their families who have navigated decades of grief compounded by relentless public attention to the manner of their loved ones' deaths, embody resilience in the face of trauma that most cannot imagine their ongoing advocacy for victim-centered approaches to crime coverage and for systemic reforms that might prevent future tragedies, transforms personal loss into broader social benefit. In examining Dahmer's legacy, we must hold in tension multiple truths: that his crimes were the product of individual pathology, while also reflecting societal failures in recognizing and responding to warning signs, that understanding such extreme cases serves legitimate purposes in psychology, law enforcement, and public safety, while also risking exploitation and re-traumatization, that remembering victims honors their humanity, while constant media attention can compound their families' suffering. These tensions cannot be fully resolved, but must be navigated with care, recognition of competing interests, and commitment to prioritizing the dignity of those most directly affected. The questions Dahmer's case raises about the origins of extreme pathology, the possibility of prevention, and the nature of evil itself resist simple answers. His story, from isolated child to methodical killer to cultural symbol of a particular species of horror, serves ultimately as testament to the complexity of human psychology, the fragility of the social structures meant to protect us, and the enduring need for vigilance, empathy, and willingness to intervene when we observe those who are struggling, before struggle transforms into something that can never be undone. When you think of Jeffrey Dahmer, what comes to mind has evolved over 3 decades, from the immediate horror of discovery to the complex legacy that persists in criminal justice, psychology, cultural memory, and ongoing debates about how society engages with its darkest chapters. His case transcends the boundaries of typical criminal history, becoming instead a multifaceted study in pathology prevention and the responsibilities we bear to both understand such extreme deviance and honor those who suffered from it. The ripples of his crimes continue shaping fields as diverse as forensic psychology, law enforcement training, victim advocacy, and cultural approaches to true crime, creating a legacy that extends far beyond the individual acts that defined his life. Criminal psychology has been permanently enriched and complicated by the comprehensive documentation his case provided. The detailed confessions he offered, combined with extensive physical evidence and multiple psychological evaluations, created an archive that researchers continue mining decades later. His case challenges and refines theories about serial killer typologies, the role of paraphilias in violent crime, and the distinctions between compulsion and choice that determine criminal responsibility studies of necrophilic homicide, sexual sadism, and the psychology of possession. All reference his case as exemplar, providing data that informs both academic understanding and practical application in criminal profiling. The FBI's behavioral analysis protocols incorporate lessons from his hunting patterns, his victim selection strategies, and his methods of concealment, demonstrating how organized offenders can operate extensively before detection. Forensic science advanced through the challenges his crimes presented. Investigators developing new techniques for victim identification, from fragmentary remains for chemical analysis of disposal methods, and for reconstruction of timelines when physical evidence had been deliberately destroyed or dispersed, the blue barrel filled with acid-dissolved remains, the photographic documentation he maintained, the preserved body parts stored in refrigeration, all required forensic approaches that pushed existing methodologies and contributed to refined protocols still used in complex homicide investigations. Today, law enforcement agencies transformed their operational approaches through hard lessons learned from intervention failures that punctuated his killing spree. Police training nationwide now emphasizes the Konarak synthesomphone case as definitive example of how assumptions, implicit biases, and inadequate investigation can have fatal consequences. The officers who returned the 14-year-old to Dahmer, despite evidence of injury, despite witness concerns, despite the smell of decomposition in apartment 213, became cautionary figures in discussions about the necessity of thorough welfare, checks the importance of listening to community members, and the dangers of allowing convenience to override duty missing persons. Protocols, particularly for cases involving marginalized populations, have been revised to ensure that vulnerability receives appropriate investigative attention rather than dismissal. Legal standards for insanity determinations continue referencing his trial, where the jury's finding that he was sane despite profound paraphilic disorders established precedent about the distinction between mental illness and legal responsibility. His case demonstrates that understanding right from wrong, possessing capacity for planning and exercising behavioral control, can coexist with severe psychological abnormality. This principle guides competency evaluations in jurisdictions nationwide, providing framework for distinguishing between diminished capacity and legal culpability. Cultural memory holds Dahmer as arguably the most recognizable serial killer of modern American history, his name synonymous with a particular intersection of suburban normalcy and unimaginable horror. The true crime industry that generates billions in annual revenue places him at its center, with his case producing continuous content across every platform, from academic documentaries to sensationalized dramatizations to podcast deep dives. This raises persistent questions about the line between education and exploitation, between legitimate interest in understanding criminal psychology and voyeuristic consumption of trauma. The 2022 Netflix series that became one of the platform's most watched productions, while devastating victims' families, exemplifies these unresolved tensions. Victim advocacy organizations have leveraged his case to advance principles ensuring that in coverage and commemoration, victims are honored as individuals rather than reduced to statistics. The 17 men whose lives he took deserve recognition that extends beyond their final moments. Stephen Mark Hicks, Stephen Walter, Tuomi, James, Edward Dockstator, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Hughes, Raymond Lamont Smith, Edward Warren Smith, Ernest Marcus, Miller, David Courtney, Thomas Curtis, Durrell, Straughter, Errol, Lindsay, Anthony Sears, Tony, Anthony, Hughes, Conorak, Synthesomphone, Matt Cleveland, Turner, Jeremiah, Benjamin, Weinberger, Oliver, Joseph Lacey, and Joseph Arthur Braidhoft. Each possessed dreams, relationships, and value that their families and communities continue grieving the work to document who these men were, what they contributed, and how their absences created irreparable voids provides necessary counterweight to the overwhelming focus on their killer. The LGBTQ community, particularly in Milwaukee, processed his targeting of gay men as exposure of vulnerabilities created by marginalization and societal dismissal of crimes against sexual minorities. Advocacy emerging from this trauma has driven improvements in hate crime legislation, police training regarding violence against LGBTQ individuals, and resources for investigating disappearances within these populations. The conversation evolved beyond Dahmer, specifically to address broader patterns of violence disproportionately affecting those at intersections of multiple marginalized identities. Milwaukee carries his crimes as permanent element of civic identity, integrating this dark chapter while refusing to allow it to define the city's character. Memorials honor victims, community programs ensure lessons learned translate into protective actions, and continued policy reforms demonstrate commitment to preventing similar tragedies. The physical spaces where murders occurred have been demolished, but the memory persists, shaping approaches to public safety, vulnerable population protection, and institutional responsibility. Educational institutions across disciplines, from neuroscience, examining potential neurological abnormalities, to sociology, analyzing how isolation contributes to violence, to philosophy, debating the nature of evil, incorporate his case into curricula. Hundreds of academic papers, dissertations, and books have examined his psychology, his crimes, and their aftermath, ensuring continued scholarly attention to understanding human behavior. At its extremes, mental health professionals gained refined understanding of paraphilia development and the rare circumstances where multiple factors combine to produce violent outcomes. His recognition that his desires were abnormal combined with his concealment rather than seeking help informs approaches to treating individuals with concerning paraphilic interests, while highlighting the critical importance of creating environments where people can seek help for disturbing thoughts before they manifest in actions. Prison reform discussions reference the security failures that enabled his murder, examining how correctional systems protect even those who have committed heinous crimes. The assignment of Dahmer, Anderson, and Scarver to unsupervised work detail prompted investigations and policy changes that continue influencing how vulnerable prisoners are managed. The balance between remembering to learn and remembering in ways that cause additional harm requires constant negotiation. As each generation encounters these stories through contemporary media vehicles, society must hold multiple truths simultaneously: that his crimes resulted from individual pathology, while also reflecting systemic failures, that understanding serves legitimate purposes while risking exploitation, that honoring victims is essential while constant attention compounds families' suffering. Jeffrey Dahmer's legacy serves as comprehensive reminder that institutional safeguards depend entirely on individuals implementing them, that vulnerable populations require specific protections precisely because marginalization creates exploitation opportunities. The consequences of such crimes extend far beyond immediate victims. encompassing families, communities, and collective security. The questions his case raises about pathology, origins, prevention possibilities, and evil's nature resist simple resolution, but demand continued examination. In the end, his story compels confrontation with uncomfortable truths about human capacity for darkness, society's capacity for oversight failure, and the responsibilities we bear to protect one another, particularly the most vulnerable among us. The 17 lives destroyed represent losses that ripple across generations, their absence a permanent void that no amount of analysis or understanding can fill. As we continue grappling with his legacy, we must ensure that fascination never overshadows compassion, that study serves prevention rather than voyeurism, and that the names of those who died are spoken with the respect and remembrance their humanity demands long after the name of their killer has been reduced to cautionary footnote in discussions about what happens when darkness goes unrecognized, until it is far too late to prevent. The irreversible Jeffrey Dahmer's legacy extends across the landscape of American criminal history, like few other cases, leaving marks on forensic psychology, law enforcement practice, victim advocacy, and cultural consciousness that persist 3 decades after his crimes were discovered and nearly 30 years since his death in a Wisconsin prison bathroom. From his birth in 1960 to his final breath in 1994, his story charts a trajectory from isolated suburban child to methodical serial killer to cultural symbol of a particular species of American horror, one that combines mundane settings with acts that continue to challenge our understanding of human capacity for extreme pathology. The criminal psychology field has been fundamentally shaped by the comprehensive documentation his case provided. His detailed confessions, spanning 17 murders committed between 1978 and 1991, created an archive that researchers continue analyzing for insights into necrophilic homicide, paraphilic disorders, and the psychology of possession-driven serial murder. The 9-year gap between Stephen Hicks and Stephen Tuomi challenged existing theories about serial killer acceleration, demonstrating that dormancy periods can extend far longer than conventional models predicted, while his systematic approach to victim selection, hunting preservation, and shrine construction provided unprecedented data about organized offenders who operate through careful planning rather than impulsive violence. Forensic science protocols were refined through challenges his disposal methods presented, from acid dissolution of remains in blue barrels to preservation techniques involving acetone and formaldehyde to photographic documentation systems that served both as trophies and process records. Investigators developed approaches to victim identification, from fragmentary evidence, timeline, reconstruction, from limited physical traces, and chemical analysis of novel disposal methods. These advances continue informing how complex homicide cases are processed. Today, law enforcement training was permanently altered by the catastrophic intervention failures that allowed his killing to continue. The Conorak synthesomphone incident, where Milwaukee police officers returned a drugged, bleeding 14-year-old to his killer. Despite witness protests and despite the overwhelming smell of decomposition in apartment 213, became the definitive case study in how implicit bias, inadequate investigation, and prioritizing convenience over thoroughness can have fatal consequences. Police academies nationwide now teach this case as an essential lesson in the necessity of complete welfare, checks the importance of listening to community witnesses, particularly women and people of color, whose concerns were dismissed, and the dangers of making assumptions about situations involving marginalized populations, the legal system's handling of his insanity. Defense established precedent that continues guiding competency determinations. His trial demonstrated that severe paraphilias, including necrophilia, do not automatically negate criminal responsibility, that understanding right from wrong and possessing capacity for behavioral control can coexist with profound psychological abnormality. The jury's verdict that he was legally sane, despite meeting diagnostic criteria for multiple mental disorders, affirmed principles about the distinction between mental illness and legal culpability that inform courtroom battles over criminal responsibility. To this day, cultural impact manifests in Dahmer's position as perhaps the most recognized serial killer in modern American history, his case occupying central place in the true crime industry that has exploded across every media platform, generating billions in annual revenue from podcasts, documentaries, dramatized series, and books. This prominence raises unresolved ethical questions about the balance between legitimate educational interest in understanding extreme criminal behavior and exploitative consumption of trauma. The 2022 Netflix series that became one of the platform's most watched productions while devastating victims' families through renewed public attention exemplifies these ongoing tensions between societal fascination and familial suffering. Victim advocacy has been advanced through sustained efforts to ensure the 17 men who died are remembered as individuals whose lives held value beyond the manner of their deaths. Stephen Mark Hicks, Stephen Walter, Tuomi, James, Edward Dockstater, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Hughes, Raymond Lamont Smith, Edward Warren Smith, Ernest Marquez, Miller, David Courtney, Thomas Curtis, Darrell, Straughter, Errol, Lindsay, Anthony Sears, Tony, Anthony Hughes, Conorak, Synthesomphone, Matt Cleveland Turner, Jeremiah, Benjamin Weinberger, Oliver Joseph Lacey, and Joseph Arthur Braidhoft. Each possessed dreams, relationships, and contributions that their families continue honoring through advocacy work that transforms personal tragedy into systemic reform. The LGBTQ community, particularly in Milwaukee, processed his targeting of gay men as exposure of how marginalization creates vulnerability, that predators exploit the advocacy. Emerging from this, recognition has driven improvements in hate crime legislation, police training regarding violence against sexual minorities, and resources dedicated to investigating disappearances within LGBTQ populations. The conversation evolved beyond Dahmer, specifically to address broader patterns of violence disproportionately affecting those who exist at intersections of multiple marginalized identities. Milwaukee's ongoing relationship with this chapter of its history reflects a city that has integrated rather than denied the darkness, acknowledging the failures while working to prevent recurrence through policy reforms, community education, and memorials that honor victims. The physical spaces where murders occurred have been demolished, but the memory shapes civic approaches to vulnerable population protection and institutional responsibility. Academic disciplines, from neuroscience to sociology to philosophy, continue producing research that cites his case, examining everything from potential neurological abnormalities associated with severe paraphilias to sociological factors that enable predatory behavior to philosophical debates about evil's nature and moral responsibility. Hundreds of scholarly works ensure his case remains active subject of study rather than merely historical footnote. Mental health understanding of paraphilia, development, and the rare circumstances where multiple factors combine to produce violence has been refined through analysis of his psychology, his recognition that his desires were abnormal, combined with his concealment rather than help-seeking. Before acting informs treatment approaches, while highlighting the critical importance of creating environments where people can address disturbing thoughts before they manifest in harmful actions. The distinctions that make his case particularly significant include the extended dormancy period between first and second kills the systematic nature of his operation within a small apartment. The comprehensive photographic documentation he maintained the failed experiments attempting to create living zombies through crude lobotomies, and the shrine concept that motivated his preservation of remains. Each element contributes unique data to understanding how organized serial offenders think, operate, and evolve over time. Lionel Dahmer's attempts to process his son's crimes and his own parental failures contribute ongoing perspective on recognizing warning signs, the limits of intervention, and the guilt that accompanies realization that one failed to prevent horror. His memoir and interviews provide raw examination of how parents navigate the impossible task of distinguishing severe pathology from difficult but normal adolescence. Perhaps most fundamentally, Dahmer's case serves as comprehensive reminder that institutional safeguards are only as effective as the individuals implementing them. That vulnerable populations require specific protections because their marginalization creates exploitation opportunities. The consequences of such crimes ripple across generations, affecting not just immediate victims, but families, communities, and collective sense of security, and that the questions about how such darkness emerges, why it goes unrecognized, and what society owes to both understanding and preventing it resist simple resolution, but demand continued serious examination. His story compels confrontation with uncomfortable truths about human capacity for extreme pathology, about systemic failures that enable predators to operate extensively before detection, and about collective responsibility to protect the vulnerable, to recognize warning signs, and to intervene before isolation transforms into obsession, and obsession into irreversible violence. The 17 lives he destroyed represent losses that extend far beyond the individuals themselves, creating voids in families and communities that can never be filled, in death as in life. Jeffrey Dahmer forces us to examine the intersection of individual pathology and societal failure, the adequacy of mental health and criminal justice systems, and the disturbing reality that such extensive killing occurred in a major American city for over a year without detection. His legacy endures not in admiration or morbid fascination, but as testament to what happens when compulsion overwhelms conscience, when loneliness metastasizes into need for absolute control, when warning signs go unheeded, and when society fails its most vulnerable members. The weight of this case continues shaping our understanding of criminal psychology, victim advocacy, law enforcement practice, and the true cost of isolation taken to its most devastating extreme. His final resting cremation, his story preserved in archives and academic studies and ongoing debates, serves as permanent reminder of our collective obligation to recognize darkness before it claims innocent lives, to protect those who are vulnerable, and to remember that behind every statistic, every case study, every documentary subject, There were real people whose absence represents irreplaceable human loss. The questions. Jeffrey Dahmer's case resist final answers, yet demand continued examination 3 decades after his arrest and nearly 30 years following his death in Colombia. Correctional institution. The ripples of his crimes continue shaping multiple domains, from forensic psychology to victim advocacy, from law enforcement training to cultural debates about how society engages with extreme criminal behavior. His story serves not as closed chapter, but as ongoing study in the intersection of individual pathology, systemic failure, and collective responsibility to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit marginalization for predatory purposes. Criminal psychology remains permanently enriched by the comprehensive documentation his case provided, the detailed confessions, psychological evaluations, and extensive physical evidence created an archive that continues informing research into necrophilic homicide, paraphilic disorders, and the psychology of possession-driven serial murder. His 9-year dormancy between first and second victims challenges conventional acceleration models, while his systematic approach to hunting, victim selection, and shrine construction provides data about organized offenders that influences profiling methodologies used by behavioral analysis units. Nationwide, the distinction his trial established between possessing severe mental disorders and lacking criminal responsibility continues guiding legal standards for competency determinations in courtrooms across the country. Forensic science protocols developed to address the unique challenges his disposal methods presented, from acid dissolution to preservation techniques to timeline reconstruction from fragmentary remains, continue influencing how complex homicide investigations are processed. The documentation he maintained, particularly his extensive photographic records, provided unprecedented insight into how certain serial offenders ritualize and memorialize their crimes, informing investigative approaches to cases involving similar documentation patterns. Law enforcement agencies transformed operational procedures through lessons extracted from intervention failures that punctuated his 13-year killing spree. The Konarak synthesomphone incident became the definitive teaching case about how implicit bias, inadequate investigation, and assumption-driven decision-making can have fatal consequences. Police training programs emphasize this case when teaching the necessity of thorough welfare checks, the importance of listening to community witnesses whose concerns are often dismissed, and the critical need to question assumptions, particularly when dealing with marginalized populations. Missing persons protocols were revised to ensure vulnerability receives investigative attention rather than dismissal. The 17 men whose lives Jeffrey Dahmer took deserve recognition that extends far beyond the circumstances of their deaths. Stephen Mark Hicks, Stephen Walter, Tuomi, James, Edward, Doc Stater, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Hughes, Raymond Lamont Smith, Edward Warren Smith, Ernest Marcus, Miller, David Courtney, Thomas, Curtis, Darrell, Straughter, Errol, Lindsay, Anthony Sears, Tony, Anthony, Hughes, Konarak, Synthesomphone, Matt Cleveland, Turner, Jeremiah, Benjamin Weinberger, Oliver, Joseph Lacey, and Joseph Arthur Braidhoft. Each possessed dreams, relationships, and contributions to their communities that their families continue honoring through advocacy work that transforms personal tragedy into efforts ensuring other vulnerable individuals receive the protection these 17 did not. The LGBTQ community processed his targeting of gay men as exposure of how marginalization creates vulnerability that predators systematically exploit. Advocacy emerging from this recognition has driven concrete improvements in hate crime legislation, police training regarding violence against sexual minorities, and resources dedicated to investigating crimes within these populations, demonstrating how tragedy, when channeled through organized advocacy, can produce systemic change that protects future generations. Milwaukee carries this chapter of its history as a permanent element of civic identity. The city has integrated, rather than denied, the darkness, implementing policy reforms, establishing memorials, and maintaining community education programs that ensure lessons learned translate into protective actions for current vulnerable populations. The physical spaces where murders occurred have been demolished, but the memory shapes ongoing approaches to public safety and institutional responsibility. Cultural engagement with the case, through the explosive growth of true crime media, raises persistent ethical questions about the balance between legitimate interest in understanding extreme criminal behavior and exploitative consumption of trauma. Each new documentary series or dramatization must navigate tension between public fascination and victims' families' ongoing suffering, between education and sensationalism. The unresolved nature of these tensions reflects broader societal struggles with how to remember dark chapters in ways that serve learning without causing additional harm. Academic research across disciplines continues producing scholarship that examines his psychology, his crimes, and their implications, from neuroscience, studying potential brain abnormalities, to sociology, analyzing how isolation contributes to violence, to philosophy, debating the nature of evil and moral responsibility. Hundreds of works ensure his case remains active subject of scholarly inquiry, rather than merely historical artifact. Mental health professionals gained refined understanding of how paraphilias develop and the rare circumstances where multiple factors combine to produce violent outcomes. His case illustrates both the limits of intervention when individuals conceal pathology and the critical importance of creating environments where people can seek help for disturbing thoughts before they manifest in harmful actions. Perhaps most fundamentally, Dahmer's case serves as a comprehensive reminder that institutional safeguards depend entirely on the individuals implementing them, that vulnerable populations require specific protections precisely because their marginalization creates exploitation opportunities, and that consequences of such crimes ripple across generations, affecting families, communities, and collective sense of security. The questions about how such darkness emerges, why it goes unrecognized, and what society owes to understanding and preventing it demand continued examination, even as they resist simple resolution. His story compels confrontation with uncomfortable truths about human capacity for extreme pathology, about systemic failures that enable extensive predation before detection, and about our collective responsibility to recognize warning signs, to intervene when we observe isolation transforming into obsession, and to protect those who are most vulnerable to exploitation. The weight of 17 lives lost to his compulsions represents costs that cannot be measured simply in individual deaths, but must be understood as extending through families, across communities, and into the broader social fabric. In examining Jeffrey Dahmer's legacy, we must hold multiple truths simultaneously: that his crimes resulted from individual pathology, while also reflecting societal failures in recognition and intervention. that understanding such cases serves legitimate purposes in psychology, law enforcement, and prevention, while also risking exploitation. That honoring victims requires both remembering who they were and ensuring their deaths contribute to protecting others. These tensions cannot be fully resolved, but must be navigated with care, recognition of competing interests, and commitment to prioritizing the dignity of those most directly affected by violence. The final accounting of his life, from isolated suburban child to methodical serial killer to cultural symbol, demonstrates how absence of connection, absence of intervention, and absence of institutional vigilance can combine with individual pathology to produce catastrophic outcomes. His legacy endures not in fascination or notoriety, but a stark reminder of what happens when warning signs go unheeded, when vulnerable populations are dismissed, when loneliness metastasizes into need for absolute control, and when society fails its most basic obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves from predators who exploit marginalization as hunting ground. As we close this examination, the 17 names must be spoken again with the respect their humanity demands. Stephen Mark Hicks, Stephen Walter, Tuomi, James, Edward, Doc Stater, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Hughes, Raymond, Lamont Smith, Edward Warren Smith, Ernest, Markey, Miller, David Courtney, Thomas Curtis, Durrell, Straughter, Errol, Lindsay, Anthony Sears, Tony, Anthony Hughes, Conorak, Synthesomphone, Matt Cleveland, Turner, Jeremiah Benjamin Weinberger, Oliver Joseph Lacey, and Joseph Arthur Braidhoft. These men deserve to be remembered, not as statistics in a serial killer's count, but as individuals whose absence represents irreplaceable loss, whose families continue grieving, and whose deaths must serve as permanent reminder of our collective responsibility to recognize darkness, to intervene before it claims innocent lives, and to ensure that society's most vulnerable members receive the protection that these 17 were denied. When we return to the question posed at the beginning of this examination, when you think of Jeffrey Dahmer, what comes to mind? The answer has necessarily deepened through the journey from isolated child in suburban Ohio to methodical killer operating from a Milwaukee apartment to cultural symbol whose legacy continues shaping multiple fields. 3 decades after his crimes were discovered, his case stands not as simple chronicle of serial murder, but as intersection point where psychology, criminology, sociology, and ethics converge, forcing confrontation with fundamental questions about human nature, societal responsibility, and how we remember horror while honoring those it consumed. The transformation of criminal psychology through comprehensive study of his case cannot be overstated. His detailed confessions, combined with extensive physical evidence and multiple psychiatric evaluations, created research archive that continues informing understanding of necrophilic homicide, paraphilic disorders, and possession-driven serial murder. The behavioral analysis protocols used by law enforcement agencies nationwide incorporate data from his victim selection patterns, his methods of concealment, and his systematic approach to creating what he termed his collection. The 9-year dormancy between Stephen Hicks and Stephen Tuomi challenged existing theories about serial killer acceleration, while his ability to maintain employment, navigate social situations, and avoid detection for over a year in a small apartment demonstrated how organized offenders can compartmentalize their pathology in ways that defy easy categorization. Forensic science advanced through the technical challenges his disposal methods presented from acid dissolution in blue barrels to preservation techniques involving acetone and formaldehyde to victim identification from fragmentary remains. Protocols developed during investigation of his crimes continue influencing how complex homicide cases are processed. The photographic documentation he maintained provided unprecedented insight into how certain serial offenders ritualize and memorialize their acts, informing investigative approaches when similar patterns emerge. Law enforcement agencies underwent permanent transformation through catastrophic intervention failures that allowed his killing to continue. The return of Conorak's synthesomphone to apartment 213 by officers who dismissed witness concerns and failed to investigate adequately became definitive case study taught in police academies nationwide about the fatal consequences of implicit bias, inadequate questioning, and assumption-driven decision-making. Missing persons protocols were revised to ensure that vulnerability receives appropriate investigative attention, particularly for marginalized populations whose disappearances might historically have been dismissed or deprioritized. The legal system's handling of his insanity defense established precedent that continues guiding competency determinations in courtrooms across the country. His trial demonstrated that severe paraphilias do not automatically negate criminal responsibility, that understanding right from wrong and possessing capacity for behavioral control can coexist with profound psychological abnormality. The jury's verdict affirmed principles about distinction between mental illness and legal culpability that remain foundational to how courts navigate questions of criminal responsibility. Cultural impact manifests in Dahmer's position as perhaps the most recognized serial killer in modern American history, his case occupying central place in true crime industry that generates billions in annual revenue. Yet this prominence raises persistent ethical questions about balance between legitimate educational interest in understanding extreme criminal behavior and exploitative consumption of trauma. The families of Stephen Mark Hicks, Stephen Walter Tuomi, James, Edward Doxtator, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Hughes, Raymond Lamont, Smith, Edward Warren, Smith, Ernest, Marquise, Miller, David Courtney, Thomas, Curtis, Darrell, Strauder, Errol, Lindsay, Anthony Sears, Tony, Anthony Hughes, Conorak, Synthesomphone, Mike Cleveland Turner, Jeremiah, Benjamin Weinberger, Oliver, Joseph Lacey, and Joseph Arthur Braidhoft continue navigating grief compounded by relentless public attention to the manner of their loved ones' deaths. Their advocacy for victim-centered approaches to crime coverage transforms personal tragedy into protection for others. The LGBTQ community, particularly in Milwaukee, processed his targeting of gay men as exposure of how marginalization creates vulnerability that predators systematically exploit. The advocacy emerging from this recognition has driven concrete improvements in hate crime legislation, police training, and investigative resources, demonstrating how tragedy, when channeled through organized effort, can produce systemic change protecting future generations. Milwaukee carries this chapter as a permanent element of civic identity. The city has integrated rather than denied the darkness, implementing reforms, establishing memorials, and maintaining education programs that translate lessons into protective actions. The physical spaces where murders occurred have been demolished, but memory shapes ongoing approaches to vulnerable population protection and institutional responsibility. Academic disciplines, from neuroscience to philosophy, continue producing research examining his psychology, his crimes, and their implications. Hundreds of scholarly works ensure his case remains active, subject of inquiry, informing understanding of extreme pathology, development consequences, and potential prevention. Mental health professionals gained refined understanding of how paraphilias develop and the rare circumstances where multiple factors combine to produce violence, while recognizing both limits of intervention when individuals conceal pathology and critical importance of creating environments where people can seek help before thoughts manifest in actions. Jeffrey Dahmer's legacy serves as comprehensive reminder that institutional safeguards depend entirely on individuals implementing them, that vulnerable populations require specific protections because marginalization creates exploitation opportunities, and that consequences ripple across generations, affecting families, communities, and collective security. His story compels confrontation with uncomfortable truths about human capacity for extreme pathology, about systemic failures, enabling extensive predation before detection, and about collective responsibility to recognize warning signs, intervene when isolation transforms into obsession, and protect those most vulnerable to exploitation. The weight of 17 lives lost represents cost extending far beyond individual deaths through families, across communities, into broader social fabric. The questions his case raises about how such darkness emerges, why it goes unrecognized, and what society owes to understanding and preventing. It resists simple resolution, but demand continued examination as each generation encounters this story through contemporary media. We must ensure that fascination never overshadows compassion, that study serves prevention rather than voyeurism, and that victims are remembered with respect their humanity demands. In the end, Jeffrey Dahmer transcended his origins as troubled suburban child to become something far more complex, a case study in intersection of individual pathology and societal failure, a catalyst for reforms in multiple fields, and a permanent reminder of what happens when warning signs go unheeded, when vulnerable populations are dismissed, and when loneliness metastasizes into need for absolute control. His final rest in cremation, his ashes divided between parents who failed in different ways to prevent his trajectory. His story preserved in archives and ongoing analysis serves as testament to devastating consequences. When compulsion overwhelms conscience, when isolation transforms into horror, and when society fails its most basic obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves, his legacy endures, not in notoriety, but as stark reminder that behind every case study, every documentary subject, every true crime narrative, there were real people whose absence represents irreplaceable human loss and whose memory demands we remain vigilant against the darkness that can flourish when we fail to recognize, intervene, and protect